Started later than I wanted to, but here I am either way. Alright, we are at 2 hours. I'm on the next section. I am doing Flask now. I don't know too much about this. I already did the HTML, and I sent in the little tiny website that I made to pass all the requirements. But I mean, I did a little more than the minimum necessity, but either way, I wanted to save my time of building a website for like the final project. 'Cause the final projects, I'm probably gonna build a website. I don't know. I mean, I could do something smaller, but I mean, I'd like to do something nice and cool. I don't know. See how it goes. But I believe Flask uses Python or something. I don't know. The whole HTML, CSS, and JavaScript thing was tripping me out because you have HTML on one file, a CSS in another one, and you put things you could put in HTML, you put in CSS just to clean up your HTML file. Just for style and preference and the way it looks and whatnot. So that's cool because it makes it look more organized. So that was interesting. But then JavaScript being, you could make JavaScript a separate file, but you could also put it in HTML, which that was a trip too, because I was not expecting to just be able to put a different coding language within the same file of another. So that was really tripping me out and interesting. But this is gonna be Flask. It's back in development. Don't know too much about it. I think it has something to do with Python. I don't know. That this is a 2-hour video, and I believe it's just about Flask and things that Flask uses. Oh, SQLite and Python. Looks like they talk about that here.
You're still on restroom break.
Oh, yeah, I didn't mean to leave that up.
Oh, so you're not recording?
I am recording. It's live right now. I just didn't realize I had that up. I wasn't paying attention. Yep. Oh, and I guess I need to get rid of this too. Bring this back up. My little.
Can they see it?
Huh? Yeah. Well, I got it in the top right corner of the screen. So anything that I'm doing in here, they can also see. Get rid of all this. I don't need this anymore. Did I show you my full website? I
Yeah.
did, right?
You did.
Yeah.
I teased you for the tiny eyes.
Tiny eyes?
Mm-hmm. No capital eyes.
Oh. Like it's a quick project. It wasn't here. I can show it real quick. Where is it? The only problem with it is like, so, what? Oh, let me do that. Is I put images and videos in it, but it doesn't send the images and videos, so I don't know if that matters. But I mean, just for the sake of discussion, here's my little website. It's not much going on here. I use the span. I don't know what it's called. The indexes. Well, this you'll see what this does in a second. But these are just buttons that link to the other pages, and I just had to have 4 pages that all linked up. So if you click videos, this tells you you're still on videos, and this has my username for the page, and it's like this. You know, there's a little video I put in here. Nothing else really. I mean, I'm just trying to use all the features they wanted me to use. Here I put 2 pictures, a little text, and then on this part I put just, you trying to use the different features, like using I don't believe this was a table, this was a list, so just a style of a list. And then because I really didn't have any ideas about how I wanted to do this, because obviously I wasn't doing a full project or nothing, I'm just practicing the usefulness. And then here was the only thing that I actually used JavaScript for, was just to make these buttons do this. Nothing crazy, very simple. I mean, just to basically, get what was requested. So, but other than that, I mean, I got the HTML and JavaScript and all that. JavaScript has to do with coding, so it's good to know coding to use the JavaScript stuff. But the HTML stuff, I mean, really, you just look that stuff up, and if you want to, like, you can do that on the fly. It's not even that complicating. Neither is the CSS. The CSS is just stuff in HTML that you can put in a side folder, so it's not taking up all the space and making the file look like ugly. But other than that, I'm gonna start on this part. We'll see where this goes, and I'll close the door a little bit. Oh, it's in the top. Oh man. Let's see. There we go. Now it's not. Okay. Good to know. What's that doing there? Like a cloth thing of sorts. Alright. Got a lot going on. Okay, here we go. Volume at. That's fine. I love this intro. It's so soothing. I need to make that like my morning alarm or something.
This is CS50, and this is already week 9, and I dare say this week is the most representative of what you'll be doing after the class if you so choose to program in the future and tackle some project that's new to you. In fact, the closest to this week was perhaps week 6, wherein we didn't really introduce all that many new concepts, but really translated them from C into Python. And so this week in particular, the goal is to really synthesize the past 10 weeks of class, drawing upon a lot of the building blocks that are hopefully now metaphorically in your toolbox, and gives you an opportunity now to apply those ideas to new problems, in particular web programming. So every day you and I are using the web in some form, every day you and I are using mobile apps in some form, and we said last week that the languages underlying a lot of those applications are HTML and JavaScript for the layout and aesthetics, and then also in part JavaScript for a lot of the client side interactivity that you might experience nowadays. Well, today we come full circle and bring back a server-side component whereby we'll again write some Python, we'll again write some SQL code, and use it to make our full-fledged own web applications, and in turn, if you so choose, mobile applications as for your final project as well. So up until now, when we did anything with the web, you ran this command last week, HTTP server, which literally did just that. It spawned a so-called HTTP server that is a web server whose purpose in life is just to serve up content from like your current folder, any files therein, any folders therein. And so all of the URLs generally followed a certain format. So if your URL were example.com, Slash, recall, just denotes the root of the web server. And so in there, typically by default, you would see a directory index. We'll see today that that goes away, because generally when you visit something.com/, you want to see the actual website, not the contents of everything in the server. So we'll see how to address that. But the URLs up until now have been of form like file.html, literally referencing a file in that folder, or folder/, which just means whatever is inside of that folder, or folder/file.html, or ... You can nest these things however long that you want. And recall that more generally, we said that you're referring to some kind of path on the server, where the path is a step of folders ending in perhaps a file name. So today we're going to generalize that, at least in terms of nomenclature, and start talking more about routes, because essentially in web programming, we are going to exercise a lot more control over what is in the URL. So back in the day, it referred to literally a file on the server, and as recently as last week, the URLs referred to literally a file on the server. However, we'll see in code that we can actually just parse this, that is, analyze what is after the domain name in a URL, and just use this as generic input to the server to figure out what kind of output to produce. We're going to see the same convention, though. If you want to pass in specific parameters, key value pairs, we'll use a question mark after our so-called route, key equals value, and then if there's another one or more, we'll just separate them by ampersands. And to do all of this, we're going to recall the inside of those virtual envelopes. Recall that if we did something like on google.com to search for cats, what was really being sent to the server was a request for /search, which notice is not search.html. There's no folder per se there. This is just the name of a program, really, running on Google servers, and that's going to be the so-called route that we ourselves start programming today. Question mark q equals cats just meant that the query parameter, the input from the web form, is going to contain, in this particular example, the word cats. So how are we going to all do this? So we could implement our own web server in C. It would be a nightmare to use a language as low level as C and actually deal with something as high level as writing code for the web. We're instead going to use Python for the most part, if only because it's much higher level. But even then, we would probably, if we wanted to do this thing from scratch, we would have to write a lot of Python code to analyze the insides of these envelopes, figure out what inputs are being passed to the server, and then figure out how to access that in Python code. It's just a lot of work to just get a web application up and working. And so what the world generally does is they don't reinvent the wheel of writing their own web server. Rather, they use an off-the-shelf, fairly generic web server, or application server as it might be called. And we, for instance, are going to use something called Flask. Now, Flask is a framework, as the world would say, or more specifically a micro framework, which just means it's a library of code that other people wrote to make it easier for us to implement web applications. So they took the time to figure out how to handle GET requests on a server, POST requests on a server, figure out how to extract key value pairs from URLs, the sort of commodity stuff that literally every web application on the internet has to do anyway, so we don't have to retrace those steps ourselves. What this will allow us to do is only implement the problems that we care about by using this framework. And to be clear, a framework, much like Bootstrap, is not only a library that someone else has written for you, but it's like a set of conventions that you follow in order to use the library in their recommended way. So it's more of a generic term that includes library and a set of conventions. And how do you know how to use either? You just read the documentation or take a class in which we're about to give you an introduction to some of this right here. So instead of running today http-server to start a web server that just serves up static content, files and folders in our account, we're instead going to run the command moving forward, Flask space run, and this is going to look for code that we've written in our current directory, and if it is in accordance with the conventions to which I'm alluding by using this so-called framework, then it's going to start our web application on some TCP port, for instance 8080, as we discussed last week. To do this, all we have to have in our current folder is minimally a file called app.py by default. This is hinting at an application written in the language called Python, and what code we put in there we'll soon see. And then ideally we would have another text file called requirements.txt by convention, inside of which is just one per line the name of all of the libraries that we want this web application to include. In other words, if I go over here to VS Code, if I don't have such a file, that's fine, but I want to use a framework like Flask. Recall our pip command for installing Python packages. I could just say pip install Flask enter, and that would go ahead and install the Flask framework or library for me, just like we did a few weeks ago with installing the silly little cowsay library as well. I've already done that in advance, and better still, I've come with my code today, both of these files, app.py and requirements.txt. And in fact, if I go ahead and create one just for fun here, all you need do in a requirements.txt file is literally put the name of the library that you want to include. And then you run pip in a slightly different way to install that library or any other libraries that are in that file as well. So let me wave my hands at the requirements.txt for moving forward. It just means what libraries do you want to use with this web application. So you don't have to remember or memorize them and type them all out manually. All right, so what's going to go inside of app.py? Well, the minimal amount of code that we can write to make our own web application that does something like print out hello world to my browser could look like this. Now, there's a bit of new syntax here, but not all that much today moving forward. The very first line just says, from Flask, import Flask, which is a weird way of just saying, give me access to the Flask library. Capitalization, no matters. And so the package that we're using is called Flask, lowercase. But we want to have access to a special function in there called Flask, capital F. So this is sort of a copy-paste line. The next one's a little weird looking, but it essentially says, give me a variable called app, and turn this file into a Flask application. We haven't seen this in a few weeks, but there was that weird if conditional that we put at the bottom of some of our Python code a few weeks back that just said if and it mentioned in there name, if name equals equals underscore underscore main underscore underscore. So we've seen an allusion to name. For our purposes, name just refers to whatever the name of this file here is. No matter what I call it, you can sort of access the current file by way of this special global variable. So this line collectively just means turn this file into a Flask application and store the result in a variable called app. So I can now do stuff with Flask. And what am I going to do? Well, down here, let me first point out a familiar syntax. I'm defining a function that I called index by convention, but I could have called it anything I want, whose sole purpose in life is just to return, quote unquote, hello world, which is the super simple output this web app is going to display. But, and this is the new syntax, I'm using here what's generally called a Python decorator, which is a type of function that essentially affects the behavior of the function right after it. So by saying app.route, quote unquote, slash, this is telling the Flask framework, associate this index function with this route, the single forward slash. And that's how we're going to take over the default behavior of the slash portion of the URL by telling it to return whatever this function returns. And we'll see this in action now. So let me go over here, say, to VS Code. And within VS Code, I'm going to whip up exactly that application in a file called app.py. Just so as to combine this and some subsequent examples, maybe the same folder, I'm going to first create a directory or folder called hello. I'm going to go into that hello folder. I'm going to go ahead and recreate that same requirements file, just for good measure, to tell the world that I want to use the Flask library here. And then I'm additionally going to create now app.py. And I'll type this fairly quickly, but I'm just reciting what we saw a moment ago. From the Flask package, import the Flask function, lowercase f, capital F, respectively. Then give me a variable called app, set it equal to that function call, passing in the name of this file, whatever it actually is. And then lastly, let's go ahead and call app.route, quote unquote, slash, which says, hey, Python, whatever the next function is, associate it with this slash route. And so I'm going to define that function. I could call it anything I want, foo or bar or baz. But insofar as slash represents the index of the website, like the default page, I'm just going to go ahead and call it by convention index, and then return for now hello, comma, world. And that's it. So whereas last week when I was writing code in HTML files, I was making web pages, now I've created what we'll call a web application. And it's an application in the sense that there's actually some logic going on there. There's some functions, there could be some conditionals, there's clearly a variable, there could be loops, and all of the sort of stuff we've seen in Scratch and C and Python as well, we'll now see back in this Python file. So how do we now run this? Well, let me go back into my terminal window here, and I'll clear it just for good measure. I'm going to go ahead and run flask run enter. I'm going to see some cryptic-looking output, but there's that familiar pop-up with the green button that wants to open up this application, whereas HTTP server uses 8080 by default, Flask uses port 5000 by default, and here we have terminal window here, and I'll clear it just for good measure. I'm going to go ahead and run flask run enter. I'm going to see some cryptic-looking output, but there's that familiar pop-up with the green button that wants to open up this application, whereas HTTP server uses 8080 by default, Flask uses port 5000 by default, and here we have it. I've just opened up my second tab, and we spent a lot of time there last week. This is the server I'm running, not on port 8080, but on port 5000 today, and there is the contents of what was spit out by my very first application. Now, even though the browser is rendering this like it is a web page, notice this. If I if I right-click or control-click anywhere on the screen and go to View Page Source, you'll see that there's no actual HTML on this page. It's literally a single line of text, hello, comma, world. If I close that and right-click or control-click again and go to Inspect, like we did last week to open up Developer Tools, you'll see that the browser has actually filled in some blanks here for me by just rendering, as it should, the minimal possible web page. But the content I actually sent to the web browser is only literally hello, comma, world. So how can I actually send a web page of my own rather than letting the browser do something like this? Well, I could go ahead and close that and go back to my application. I'm going to go ahead now and hide the terminal just because the server is still running. And what I'm going to go ahead and do here is, well, nothing's really stopping me from returning not just a string of text, but a string of HTML. And this might not look pretty, but let me go ahead and do open bracket, doc type HTML, close bracket, then HTML, then head, then title. And I'll just title this, for instance, hello, to keep it simple. Backslash title, backslash head, open bracket, body, hello, comma, world, backslash body, backslash HTML, close quotes. And I used single quotes in this case, but I could have just as easily used double quotes. But that's a full-fledged web page. Like, that's the minimal amount of content we saw last week. Actually, you know what? For good measure, let's actually add lang equals quote unquote en. So it's actually fortuitous that you use single quotes, because now I have some double quotes inside. And even though this is not pretty printed, it's just one massive mouthful of HTML all along one line, when I now go back to the browser, reload the page, as by clicking here, and then view page source again, here's what my browser received this time. Indeed, it's the full-fledged HTML. And in fact, if I close that tab and reopen Developer Tools via Inspect, now we'll see in the tab absolutely everything that I sent over, including a title, including the lang equals en. And had I typed even more, we would have seen that too. All right, so what was the point of this exercise? It feels as though that I've really just taken more time, added more complexity to achieve literally what I could have done last week by just creating index.html myself without any Python code. But I dare say what we're trying to do is lay the foundation for a full-fledged interactive website that maybe has forms that we can submit to the application that allows us to generate not just one page, but maybe 2 or 3 or any number. So what you're seeing here is sort of the beginning of Google.com's search application, or Gmail.com itself, or Facebook.com, or any web application you could think of begins with a little code that theoretically looks a little something like this. But this is kind of stupid to put HTML, hard-coded no less, in one long string here inside of my application. Let's try to factor this out. That was a lesson we preached last week about sort of factoring out our JavaScript, factoring out our CSS. We can do the same thing with our actual HTML here. And so what I'm actually going to do is import not only the Flask function, but also another function that, per its documentation, comes with Flask, called render template, with an underscore in between. This is a function whose purpose in life is to render a template, so to speak, of HTML. We'll see what we mean by template in just a bit. But down here, what I'm going to do is now delete all of that code. And let me just assume that I'm going to put that same code in a file called index.html, just like I did last week. So let's instead return the return value of render template of quote unquote index.html. Now that file does not yet exist. Indeed, if I go into my terminal window, create a second terminal just so I can leave the server running but still see what's going on, I'm going to cd into that same hello directory, type ls to list my files, and I only see app.py and requirements.txt. But it turns out, per Flask's documentation, if you want to create your own HTML files, you simply have to add a directory that by convention is called templates. And that's it. So in addition to app.py, requirements.txt, I need a folder called templates. So let's go back into VS Code, make dir templates, capitalization matters, all lowercase. Now let me go ahead and cd into templates and run the code command and create a file called index.html in the templates folder. And then super quickly, let me hide this, let me whip up that same page again, doc type HTML, HTML, lang equals quote unquote en, close bracket, head, close bracket, title, close bracket, hello, and then down here, body, close bracket, hello, comma, world. So autocomplete is helping me type quickly, but now I have a file with my HTML that this application I claim is going to spit out automatically for me. So let's see the effect. Let me go back into my other browser tab. Let me close the developer tools, and let me quite simply just click reload. and no apparent change. It's working exactly as templates, and run the code command and create a file called Flask's documentation. If you want to create your own HTML files, you simply have to add a directory that by convention is called templates. And that's it. So in addition to app.py requirements.txt, I need a folder called templates. So let's go back into VS Code, make dir templates, capitalization matters, all lowercase. Now let me go ahead and cd into templates and run the code command and create a file called index.html in the templates folder. And then super quickly, let me hide this, let me whip up that same page again, doctype HTML, HTML, lang equals add a directory that by convention is called templates. And that's it. So in addition to app.py requirements.txt, I need a folder called templates. So let's go back into VS Code, make dir templates, capitalization matters, all lowercase. Now let me go ahead and cd into templates and run the code command and create a file called index.html in the templates folder. And then super quickly, let me hide this, let me whip up that same page again, doctype HTML, HTML, lang equals quote unquote en, close bracket, head, close bracket, title, close bracket, hello, and then down here, body, close bracket, hello, comma, world. So autocomplete.
All right, stop it. Yeah. I know. Got the equals.
It's helping me type quickly, but now I have a file with my HTML that this application I claim is going to spit out automatically.
Oh, I forgot to give it a title. The title goes in the head, right? Yeah. Oh crap! I did this all wrong.
My HTML that this application I claim is going to spit out automatically for me. So let's see the effect. Let me go back into my other browser tab. Let me close the developer tools, and let me quite simply just click reload. And no apparent change. It's working exactly as it did before, but I've laid the foundation for making a much more useful layout of my files so that I can actually keep my logic, my Python code, and my HTML a bit separate from that. All right, well, how can we make this into something even more interesting? Well, let's start to take some actual user input, for instance. So wouldn't it be nice if I could pass in via the URL something like q equals cat?
Oh, I have no idea how to get a job, man. I'm not there yet. So I have no idea but I barely just started learning this stuff, so if I knew, I'd tell you, but
but maybe something like name equals David or name equals Kelly, and actually see the name that's being outputted. In other words, let me zoom in up here, and let me pretend like this happened automatically. Let me do question mark, name equals David, enter. Well, it would be nice if I saw hello, comma, David, I'll propose, rather than just hello, comma, world. So how do I actually get access to everything after the question mark? Well, here is where a framework like Flask and any number of alternatives starts to shine. It gives me that answer automatically. And so it turns out in Flask, once you've used it, you have access to a special global variable, as we'll call it, called request.args, where args just means the arguments or the parameters that were passed in to this HTTP request. So how do we use this? Well, let me go back to VS Code here. And at the very top line, in addition to importing Flask, capital F, render template, let's also import request, which is a global variable that comes with the Flask framework. And then I'm going to use it as follows. I'm going to go ahead and say a second argument to the render template function, where I'm going to say placeholder equals request. Actually, let me not do that yet. Let me first create a variable. Name equals request.args. And then let me go ahead and get the name key from the arguments. And then down here, let's go ahead and pass in placeholder equals name. So what am I doing? Here on line 8, I'm creating a variable called name. I'm storing in that the value that's in the request global variable in what's apparently a dictionary called args, specifically the name key therein. So if the thing after the question mark name equals is David, this should give me David. If it's Kelly, it should give me Kelly instead. Then what I'm doing is rendering this template called index.html, but I'm additionally passing in some named parameters. We talked briefly about that in week 6 when we introduced the idea that Python can take not only a comma-separated list of arguments, but some of which can have names. So I'm proposing that one such name of an argument to this render template function can be placeholder, for instance. Now at the moment, this code isn't going to do anything useful. If I go back indeed to the other tab, click reload after zooming in, even with my name in the URL, you'll see that we still see hello, comma, David.
But don't.
Here's where things now get interesting, and here too is what we mean by temp.
Did I spell something wrong? Well, crap. Cannot understand. Well, I'm screwed. I typed everything the same way. Placeholder. The name, the render template, request. What the I don't know. I don't know. What the template not defined. Index.html. Oh, crap. Okay. Why is this not working? It's not working for me.
If I go back into VS Code, open up index.html again, and instead of putting the word world there, what I'd like to see is not hello world, but hello, comma, placeholder. But of course, if I literally type that, I'm going to see literally placeholder, unless I surround placeholder with pairs of curly braces like this. And by using these pairs of curly braces, I'm telling Flask that I want to interpolate, so to speak, that variable. I want to substitute in its value. So this is yet another syntax. In Python, we saw f strings. In C, we saw %s when using something like printf. In an HTML file, when using Flask specifically, we use these pair of curly braces to denote this is indeed a placeholder whose value should be plugged in. So now let's go back over to the second tab. Recall, if I zoom in, that passed in already to this URL is !name equals David. And this time when I click reload, voila, now I see my actual name. And unlike the JavaScript examples last week, which were doing that through value that's in the request global, I'm going to say placeholder equals, and at the very top line, automatically. And so it turns out in Flask, once you've used it, you have access to a special global variable, as we'll call it, called request.args, where args just means the arguments or the parameters that were passed in to this HTTP request. So how do we use this? Well, let me go back to VS Code here. And at the very top line, in addition to importing Flask, capital F, render template, let's also import request, which is a global variable that comes with the Flask framework. And then I'm going to use it as follows. I'm going to go ahead and say a second argument to the render template function, where I'm going to say placeholder equals request. Actually, let me not do that yet. Let me first create a variable. Name equals request.args. And then let me go ahead and get the name key from the arguments. And then down here, let's go ahead and pass in placeholder equals name. So what am I doing? Here on line 8, I'm creating a variable called name. I'm storing in that through value that's in the request global variable in what's apparently a dictionary called args, specifically the name key therein. So if the thing after the question mark name equals is David, this should give me David. If it's Kelly, it should give me Kelly instead. Then what I'm doing is rendering this template called index.html, but I'm additionally passing in some named parameters. We talked briefly about that in week 6 when we introduced the idea that Python can take not only a comma-separated list of arguments, but some of which can have names. So I'm proposing that one such name of an argument to this render template function can be placeholder, for instance. Now at the moment, this code isn't going to do anything useful. If I go back indeed to the other tab, click reload after zooming in, even with my name in the URL, you'll see that we still see hello, comma, David. But here's where things now get interesting, and here too is what we mean by template. If I go back into VS Code, open up index.
Terminal earlier?
So
is that what
which is a global variable that comes with Flask and any number from that. HTML, lang equals quote unquote en, close bracket, head, close bracket, title, close bracket, hello, and then down here, requirements.txt. But it turns out, per Flask's documentation, if you want to create your own HTML files, you simply have to add a directory that by convention is called templates. And that's it. So in addition to app.py, requirements.txt, I need a folder called templates. So let's go back into VS Code, make dir templates, capitalization matters, all lowercase. Now let me go.
Yeah, I mean, but it's already connected to it. But I mean, I don't know where he put in his name for David, so I don't know if it was like in the terminal or something. I'm not really kind of confused. I don't know. But I'm like 34. I'm old.
Go ahead and cd into templates and run the code command and create a file called index.html in the templates folder. And then super quickly, let me hide this, let me whip up that same page again, doctype HTML, lang equals quote unquote en, close bracket, head, close bracket, title, close bracket, hello, and then down here, body, close bracket, hello, comma, world. So autocomplete is helping me type quickly, but now I have a file with my HTML that this application I claim is going to spit out automatically for me. So let's see the effect. Let me go back into my other browser tab. Let me close the developer tools, and let me quite simply just click reload, and no apparent change. It's working exactly as it did before, but I've laid the foundation for making a much more useful layout of my files so that I can actually keep my logic, my Python code, and my HTML a bit separate from that. All right, well, how can we make this into something even more interesting? Well, let's start to take some actual user input, for instance. So wouldn't it be nice if I could pass in via the URL something like q equals cats, but maybe something like name equals David or name equals Kelly, and actually see the name that's being outputted? In other words, let me zoom in up here, and let me pretend like this happened automatically. Let me do question mark, name equals David, enter. Well, it would be nice if I saw hello, comma, David, I'll propose, rather than just hello, comma, world. So how do I actually get access to everything after the question mark? Well, here is where a framework like Flask and any number of alternatives click reload after zooming in, even with my name in the URL, you'll see that we still see hello, comma, David. But here's where things now get interesting, and here too is what we mean by template. If I go back into VS Code, open up index.html again, and instead of putting the word world there, what I'd like to see is not hello world, but hello, comma, placeholder. But of course, if I literally type that, I'm going to see literally placeholder, unless I surround placeholder with pairs of curly braces like this. And by using these pairs of curly braces, I'm telling Flask that I want to interpolate, so to speak, that variable. I want to substitute in its value. So this is yet another syntax. In Python, we saw f strings. In C, we saw %s when using something like printf. In an HTML file, when using Flask specifically, we use these pair of curly braces to denote this is indeed a placeholder whose value should be plugged in. So now let's go back over to the second tab. Recall, if I zoom in, that passed in already to this URL is !name equals David. And this time when I click reload, voila, now I see my actual name. And unlike the JavaScript examples last week, which were doing everything client-side, notice here, if I go to right-click or control-click and view page source, what's noteworthy today is that David, in this case, literally came from the server. This was not rendered client-side. The server sent this HTML and specifically this text. So if I go back to the same tab here, zoom in, and change David, for instance, to Kelly, what I should see instead when I hit enter is hello, comma, Kelly. And indeed, if I go back to the source code and reload the page there, I should see in the view page source that the server sent indeed hello, comma, Kelly. So it's in this sense that it's an application. The URL is providing input to the application by way of this URL format, the so-called get string that's being passed in. And if I look at the code that I'm running, app.py is the code that's running. It is grabbing that name from the URL. I am then passing it into my index.html file, and then my HTML file is plugging the actual value in for me. And so what's going on with, for instance, these curly braces? Well, here too is where we're actually using a library. And included in Flask is another library called Jinja. And Jinja is what's called a templating library. And there's so many templating libraries in the world. Jinja is actually fairly simple, which is nice, and which is why Flask uses it. And for now, you can just think of Jinja as being the library that knows how to interpolate variables inside of pairs of curly braces. So why are we introducing yet another library? Well, the folks who implemented Flask decided that it was not worth their time reinventing the wheel of a templating language, a language via which you can figure out what values to plug in where. So they just lean on another library that someone else wrote years prior so as to not reinvent that wheel themselves. And that's all that's going on with the framework in this case. It's using perhaps multiple libraries instead. All right, so what then is a template? So this then is a template. What you're looking at here, hello, comma, placeholder, is a template in the sense that it's kind of the blueprint for the web page I want the user to see, but it's going to be dynamically generated using, indeed, this blueprint by plugging in the value of placeholder inside of those pairs of curly braces. And so that's why index.html starting today is in a folder called templates, because this is not just static HTML like the stuff we wrote last week. This is the blueprint for the actual HTML that we want the browser to spit out. But there's a bug here. Notice what's going to happen here. If I go up to this URL and I get rid of the name altogether, for instance, I just visit the /route without any key value pairs and hit enter, this is sort of bad
Yeah,
request.
that's what I was
it's an
dealing with.
HTTP 400. In fact, if you look at the tab, here's another HTTP status code that we probably haven't seen before, but 400 just means the user did something wrong by not passing in the parameter that was expected. Well, that's a little bad design if like the user has to manually type in things to the URLs. Like no human actually does that. That's not good for business or customers in general. So I can go back into app.py and just make a little bit of conditional code here. And here's too where we see what makes this an application and not just a static page. Instead of just blindly getting the name here, I could instead do something like this. Well, if the name parameter is in request.args, and this is just Python syntax for asking if this key is in this dictionary, then I'm going to go ahead and define name and set it equal to request.args, quote unquote, name. Else, if there is no name in the request, well then I might as well give some default value like name equals quote unquote world. And that alone logically makes sure that I only try to access request.arg's name if the key is actually there. So if I go back to the browser now, reload without anything else in the URL, now we're back in business. And it's saying hello, comma, world. But if I go up to the URL bar and add name equals David, enter, that too now works. So it's a web application in the sense that not only does it have function calls as well as a variable, but now we've got some conditional logic with Boolean expressions as well. All right, questions on anything we've done thus far, because it was a lot all at once. Questions thus far? Yeah. Good question. Let's try that. What if I just did question mark name equals nothing? Well, let me go back to that other tab, delete the name David, and hit enter. And I indeed see hello, comma, nothing. Why? Because the name key is provided now. It just doesn't have a value. And so the conditional has the same answer. Well, yes, name is in request.args, but there's just no value associated with it. And here again is the value, or a hint at the value of using a framework like Flask. The fact that I can just import the request global variable and then ask questions like, is this parameter in this dictionary, means I don't have to write any of the code that like figures out what the URL looks like, break it apart between the question mark and the equal signs and any ampersands therein. Like that's all sort of generic logic that every web application has to do. So again, Flask is sort of doing that lift for me, and I can just focus on the logic that I actually care about. All right, well, a quick convention here. I've used the word placeholder here just to kind of hit the nail on the head and make clear this is a placeholder. But frankly, it's a little more readable stylistically to not just put hello generic placeholder, but to say something like hello, comma, name, so that a colleague or even myself looking at this file down the line knows that, okay, we're trying to print out the user's name here. That's fine. You can change the name of these variables to be anything you want. And even though it looks weird, it's conventional in Flask to do something like this. Name equals name. But each of these names means something different. This is the name of the placeholder that I'm going to put in my actual template. This is the value that I actually want to give it. And it just keeps me a little saner by just reusing the same name instead of calling it placeholder or placeholder 1, placeholder 2, placeholder 3, or something generic like that. Now it's just a little clearer, even though it looks weird to say name equals name. Again, that just allows me to do this in my template. All right, well, what more can I do after that? Well, let me propose that we can actually go in and simplify this code a little bit. It turns out this is so common to just ask a question as to whether the parameter is there and then do something with it or not, that Flask comes with some logic to do this. And in fact, I can get rid of all 4 of these lines, just go ahead and, with confidence, declare a variable called name, set it equal to request.args, but in this so-called dictionary, use a function called get that comes with it, which technically doesn't relate to the verb that was used by HTTP. This just means literally get me the following. And if you want to get the parameter called name, you literally just say quote unquote name. However, in case there is no name parameter, you can also give this function a default value like world. And so now we've collapsed into 4 lines, from 4 lines into 1, that exact same logic. So this gets me the HTTP parameter called name. But if it's not there, it gives me a default value of world so that no matter what, this name variable has what I care about. Indeed, if I go back over here.
High school next year, I'm joining a English college, so what should I do before I start coding it? Oh, I don't know. A lot of people are asking me stuff. I'm just like, I used to work in the oil field, and then I was like a mechanic. And I'm learning how to code now, and this is pretty much where I'm at. And yeah, I don't have like the time or the money to like invest, but this is like free courses, so this is why I'm doing this. But yeah, I don't actually like have all the answers, but I mean, if anybody needed money, like I would just tell you go get a job in the oil field, but that's pretty much but this is all new to me, so I don't exactly know, but yeah.
Here, let's type in, how about name equals David again, enter. That's there. If I type in no name to request.arg, actual template, this is the value that I actually want to give it.
Here,
name equals name. But stylistically to not just put hello generic placeholder, but to say something like hello common name, so
Oh,
that a
'cause it's
colleague
over
or even
here.
myself
Okay,
looking
I
at this
see.
file down the line knows that, okay, we're
Yeah.
trying to print out the user's name here.
That's what it was.
That's fine. You can change the name of these variables to be anything you want, and even though it looks weird, it's conventional in Flask to do something like this. Name equals name. But each of these names means something different. This is the name of the placeholder that I'm going to put in my actual template. This is the value that I actually want to give it. And it just keeps me a little saner by just reusing the same name instead of calling it placeholder or placeholder 1, placeholder 2, placeholder 3, or something generic like that. Now it's just a little clearer, even though it looks weird to say.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, that's why I've been streaming it, was just because I've seen a lot of videos where people just kind of like quickly brush over it. But, well, I mean, it kind of motivates me more if I'm live streaming, but also it shows how difficult this stuff is, along with how long it actually takes and like the real world stuff. I mean, because I'm not just doing a quick video of like, hey, I did this and blah, blah, blah. I'm just like streaming the real world situation. So yeah, pretty much. Yeah. And I'm starting off at a really weird time. So I'm like 34. I've already had like multiple different types of jobs, and this is just something I've wanted to learn since I was a teenager. I almost went to ITT when I was 18, but my situation, I couldn't do it. And so instead, I just started working instead of going to school. And so now, all these years later, I'm trying to learn the one thing I wanted to learn when I was younger. So
A name equals name. Again, that just allows me to do this in my template. All right, well, what more can I do after that? Well, let me propose that we can actually go in and simplify this code a little bit. It turns out this is so common to just ask a question as to whether the parameter is there and then do something with it or not, that Flask comes with some logic to do this. And in fact, I can get rid of all 4 of these lines, just go ahead and, with confidence, declare a variable called name, set it equal to request.args, but in this so-called dictionary, use a function called get that comes with it, which technically doesn't relate to the verb that was used by HTTP. This just means literally get me the following. And if you want to get the parameter called name, you literally just say quote unquote name. However, in case there is no name parameter, you can also give this function a default value like world, and so now we've collapsed into 4 lines. From 4 lines into 1, that exact same logic. So this gets me the HTTP parameter called name, but if it's not there, it gives me a default value of world, so that no matter what, this name variable has what I care about. Indeed, if I go back over here, let's type in, how about name equals David again, enter. That's there. If I type in no name, enter, that too is now working as well. All right, well, let's see if we can refine this a bit more. Let me propose that in our next version of this, let's introduce a second route. So
trying,
2 URLs, much like what
Better
Google has
late
many
than
different
never.
URLs, as does most any web application. At the moment, I'm doing everything in my / route. So how might I move away from this? Well, let me go ahead and not only add a second route, but an actual form via which the user can type in their name. So to do this, let me propose that in index.html, instead of just printing out the user's name and trusting that they're going to have typed their name in manually to the URL, which again is not normal behavior, let's actually show the user a form via which they can do exactly that. So here's my form tag. Let's say the method I'm going to use is get, so that I see everything in the URL. Let's give myself an input whose name is name, because this is the human's name. And notice, somewhat confusingly, this name on the left is the this name on the left is the HTML attribute that we saw last week. So it's different from what we just did in Python, even though they're all called the same thing. The type of this input is going to be text. And let's go ahead and make this a little more user-friendly. Let's put some placeholder text called name, so the human knows what to type in. Let's go ahead and disable autocomplete, just so we don't see previous input into this text box. And let's auto-focus it so that the cursor is blinking in the text box by default. Then lastly, let's go ahead and have a button, the type of which is submit, so that clicking this button actually submits the form. And I'm just going to call this button like greet, because I want the user to be able to greet themselves by clicking this button. Now, I should specify action. The only other time we use action is when we actually went to https://www.google.com/search.
Let's see, name. placeholder? I thought we weren't calling it placeholder anymore. Hold on.
Let's put some placeholder text called name so the human knows what to type in. Let's go ahead and disable autocomplete just so we don't see previous input into this text box. And let's auto-focus it so that the cursor is blinking in the text box by default. Then lastly, let's go ahead and have a button, the type of which is submit, so that clicking this button actually submits the form. And I'm just going to call this button like greet, because I want the user to be able to greet themselves by clicking this button. Now, I should specify action. The only other time we used action is when we actually went to https://www.google.com/search. That's not relevant today, because I'm trying to print hello world, not search for cats and such. But this is where I too have control. If I want to submit this form to a specific location in my web application, action is where I can specify it. So why don't I pretend that there exists a route in my application called /greet. And if you go to example.com/greet, name equals David, this now will greet the user with hello, David, for instance. But /greet does not exist. If we go back to app.py, literally the only route that currently exists is /, but I can change that. I can go into my app.py as I have here, and below this function, I can go ahead and define app.route, quote unquote, /greet, and just invent any route that I want. I can then define a function that will be called whenever that route is visited. By convention, to keep myself sane, I'm going to call the function the same thing as the route, but you don't have to do this. It's just to minimize decisions I have to make. And then in this function, what I'm going to do is this: return render template greet.html, which doesn't exist yet, but that's a problem to be solved. And then I can pass in the name of the user. I'm going to go ahead and save myself a line of code and just say request.args.get, quote unquote, name, comma, world. In other words, strictly speaking, I don't need that variable on its own line. This has the effect of what we already did in index, but I'm doing it all in one elegant one-liner. And now in index, insofar as I want the index of the site to just show the user the form via which they can type in their name, this one's easy now. Render template, quote unquote, index.html, and return that template. So to recap, here's index.html, which is now a form instead of a template for hello, comma, such and such. App.py is going to return that template whenever I visit.
Oh, and I don't have to do. Okay, hold on. Oh, because it'll. Okay.
It's at the index or / of the page, and then this greet route is going to handle the case of
we still gotta make it greet HTML, right?
Greet.html, passing in the user's name. All right, I think I'm not quite good to go yet, but let's try this out. Let me go back to my browser tab, reload, and there we have it. I have a web form now instead of the hello, comma, so-and-so. I'm going to go ahead and type in my name, and notice the URL at the moment, even though Chrome is hiding it, technically it.
Okay. Didn't follow somewhere. So we're still at the normal title page. Oh, I gotta take this out. Right. Nope, that's not the problem. Okay, so let's see.
Such. App.py is going to return that template whenever I visit the index or / of the page, and then this greet route is going to handle the case of printing out greet.html, passing in the user's name. All right, I think I'm not quite good to go yet, but let's try this out. Let me go back to my browser tab, reload, and there we have it. I have a web form now instead of the hello, comma, so-and-so. I'm going to go ahead and type in my name, and notice the URL at the moment, even though Chrome is hiding it, technically it's there, /, but Chrome and most browsers today sort of hide as much stuff as they can if it's not all that intellectually interesting. But watch what happens when I click greet to the URL. It automatically sends me to /greet, name equals David. And this is just like the way the forms worked last week when we recreated our own version of Google in search.html, because the action there was google.com/search. The user was whisked away to Google server. Today, I stay on the same server because the action I used was quite simply /greet, which is assumed to be on my own server. But clearly I screwed something up because I have a big internal server error in front of me, as you soon will too, odds are, as you dive into this. 500 is the status code that means your fault somehow. Now, why is that? Well, it's unclear from this
create a-
generic black and white message. However, because I'm the developer, I can go back to VS Code, open my terminal window, and recall that I have two terminals open now, one that I can type stuff in, the other of which is still running from before. Let me open up that one, and you'll see, if I maximize my terminal window, a whole bunch of scary error messages here, but the relevant one is probably going to be, let's see, down here, raise template not found error, Jinja exceptions, template not found, greet.html. So there's a lot of esoteric error messages here, more so than usual, but the simple fact is that I just screwed up and I did not create greet.html, so file not found by the server. So the user doesn't see all that complexity. That's deliberate by design. It's generally not good for cybersecurity if you're revealing to the user all of the error messages that are happening on your server, because maybe that suggests they can hack in some way by taking advantage of those error messages and the information implicit in them. But they are there in your terminal window to actually see and diagnose. So how do I fix this? Well, not a problem. Let me shrink my terminal window back down. Let me code a file called greet.html. And in greet.html, let's create the template via which I'm going to greet the user, which ironically is the exact same as index.html used to be. So let me recreate that real quick. Doc type HTML. Let me close my terminal. HTML lang equals en. Head, title, hello, body, hello, comma, and there's my here's my placeholder, hello, comma, name. So to be clear, the index.html template doesn't have any curly braces or anything dynamic. It just spits out the HTML for the form. Greet.html spits out HTML and the actual greeting. And it's app.py that decides which of these to show the user, either index.html if they visit the slash route, or greet.html if they somehow find their way to the slash greet route, which they will automatically by simply submitting that form. All right, so let's go back into this internal server error and go back to the form. Nothing has changed with the form, but now when I type in David, click greet, not only will the URL...
That's not. Nope. Nope. Says name, render, template, HTML text. That's what it's over here. Name is not defined. Oh, because it took it away over there.
change to be slash greet.
Let me see. How does he got his? Oh, dang it.
Page, and then this greet route is going to handle the case of printing out.
Wait, so do I not need this anymore because it's on the bottom one? Let's see, let's try this. Okay, let's see. Yeah, I got it. Okay, cool.
Greet.h. My
No
placeholder,
worries.
hello,
Figure it
comma,
out.
name. So to be clear, the index.html template doesn't have any curly braces or anything dynamic. It just spits out the HTML for the form. Greet.html spits out HTML and the actual greeting. And it's app.py that decides which of these to show the user, either index.html if they visit the slash route, or greet.html if they somehow find their way to the slash greet route, which they will automatically by simply submitting that form. All right, so let's go back into this internal server error and go back to the form. Nothing has changed with the form, but now when I type in David, click greet, not only will the URL change to be slash greet question mark name equals David, I actually now see the content that I expected a moment ago. All right, well now it's an opportunity to critique. I have these two templates open, index.html and greet.html, and even if you've never done web programming before, and even if you never did HTML before last week, what is bad about this design intuitively? Say again? Abstraction in what sense? Yes, so that's exactly the hang-up I have here. There's a lot of duplication, and technically I didn't copy-paste, though I might as well have, because notice, as I very hintingly go back and forth, almost every line of code in these files is the same, except for the form, which is there or not there, or the hello, comma. Like all of the boilerplate HTML, namely everything I just highlighted here, lines 1 through 7 in greet.html, and this. And this is what we really start to mean about a template. Like, wouldn't it be nice if we could factor out all of that HTML that's common to both files, put it in literally a template that both routes can use so that I can write that boilerplate code once instead of again and again. Because imagine in your mind's eye, well, if I have 3 routes or 4 routes or 5 routes, I'm going to be like typing the same darn HTML 3, 4, 5 times. That's got to be dumb, and that's got to be solvable, as we've seen in other languages as well. So let me indeed go ahead and try to improve this. And the syntax is a little weird, but it's the kind of thing you get used to quite quickly. I'm going to go ahead and create a third HTML file now by going back to my terminal window. Inside still my templates directory, and by convention this file is going to be called layout.html. Why this? That's what the Flask documentation tells you to do. So in layout.html I can put all of my boilerplate HTML, the stuff that is invariant and doesn't change. So here we go, doc type HTML. HTML tag lang equals en, close bracket, open bracket head, open bracket title, we'll call it hello for all of the pages, open bracket body, and here's where it gets interesting. The body is the only thing that has been changing in these 2 examples. In index.html, it was a web form. In greet.html, it was just a simple string of hello, comma, so-and-so. So what I want to tell Flask is that everything in the body will just be a dynamic block of code. And the syntax for that, which takes a little bit getting used to, but it's also sort of copy-pastable, block body using %signs this time. And because I don't want any such body in the template, I'm going to literally close this block as follows. And here you see another example of sort of HTML-like syntax, but instead of using angled brackets, Jinja, the templating library that Flask uses curly brace and %sign to open a tag, and then the opposite to close it. So what you really have here are 2 Jinja tags, as we'll call them. This one is called block, and I'm defining an arbitrary name here. I could have called it foo, bar, or baz, but because I want this block to refer to the body of the page, by convention I'm going to call it body. And then this weird syntax, which is used in some other languages too, just means end whatever block you just began. And so again, you just see reasonable people disagreeing. The people who invented HTML used nice angled brackets and words like these. The people who came up with Jinja used curly braces and %signs. Why? Well, odds are these are not normal symbols that a human would type when writing code, at least in HTML, so they just chose something that probably wouldn't collide with actual syntax the human wants to use. So that's it for the template. This is now this is essentially a blueprint that doesn't have just a placeholder for a single word or value like name. I can put a whole chunk of code here now instead. And how do I do that? Well, let me go into index.html, which at the moment is a little duplicative in that it's got all of this boilerplate. So you know what? I'm going to go ahead and delete everything that is already in my layout, both above and below that web form. And now I'm going to use a bit more Jinja syntax. This too takes a little while to memorize or copy paste, but if I want index.html to use the layout.html blueprint, I can simply say extends layout.html and then close tag using %sign close bracket here. And then if what I want to plug into that layout is the following code, I can say, as before, block body, and then down here I can say end block. And that's it. And just to be a little nitpicky, I'm going to de-indent that slightly. And now, even though it looks like web pages suddenly look a lot uglier, well, they do, because like this is weird looking syntax, but I have now distilled index.html into its essence. This is the only thing that changes vis-a-vis the greeting page. And so I've put my HTML here that I care about. I've said to Flask, this is what index.html's body block shall be. Where to put it? Well, put it into that particular layout.html file. And so the logic for greet.html is the same thing. It's going to look just as weird, but again, you get used to it. Let's go ahead and delete everything that's boilerplate in greet.html, both above and below. Up at the top, let's tell Flask that greet.html2 extends layout.html. And let's go ahead and say to Flask that the block called body shall be this for greet.html. And the end of this block is now down here. And just to be nitpicky, I'll de-indent that too. So again, the pages look a little weirder now, but it's going to follow a paradigm that we just see again and again, such that the only juicy stuff is what's inside of that body block. So now, if I go back to my layout, it looks exactly like this. This indeed is a placeholder, not just for a single variable, like name or the placeholder we did before. This is the placeholder for a whole block of code that came from a file, not from a variable. And so if I go back into my other tab here, click back to go back to the web form and reload, notice that I have the familiar looking form, but if I now look at my developer, or if I look at view page source, notice everything that came from the web page, from the server. Here's that boilerplate up here.
Yeah,
here's that boilerplate down here, and here's the stuff that's unique to this page. And recall too, aesthetically, I de-indented it, which is why it's now no longer pretty printed and what the browser sees. Like, that's okay. There's no reason to obsess over the indentation in the.
Okay, hold on. Nope, it didn't work with me. Oh wait, what's that? I thought it was ENG. That's not the only thing. Okay, so we got head. No sir, no sir. Did not work out for me.
Everything that came from the and the end of
templates. It's all within templates.
This block is now down here, and just to be nitpicky, I'll de-indent that too. So again, the pages look a little weirder now, but it's going to follow a paradigm that we just.
Yeah, HTML. Extends. Oh. In block, not in body. Oh my god. No, that's it. Cool. Okay, got it. Back.
I'm in VS Code here, and I look at index.html. This is clearly indented inside of the body block, just so I know what's part of that block. The browser does not care about the server. Here's that boilerplate up here. Here's that boilerplate down here, and here's the stuff that's unique to this page. And recall too, aesthetically, I de-indented it, which is why it's now no longer pretty printed and what the browser sees. Like, that's okay. There's no reason to obsess over the indentation and the pretty printing of what the browser sees. Ultimately, the reason I did this indentation is because arguably when I'm in VS Code here and I look at index.html, this is clearly indented inside of the body block, just so I know what's part of that block. The browser does not care about superfluous white space or less thereof. All right. Questions on what we've just done here, which is to truly take this template out for a spin and now remove what redundancies I had accidentally introduced. Questions? No? Okay, amazing. All right. Well, let's go ahead and look at this URL again. I'm not liking the fact that every example we've done thus far involves putting my name or Kelly's name right there in the URL bar. Well, why is that? Well, if I have like a nosy sibling and they sit down in my browser, they're going to see like every URL I visited, including whose name was greeted. Now, that's not all that big a deal, but now imagine it's a username and a password that the form is submitting, or a credit card number that the form is submitting, or just search terms that you don't want the world knowing you're searching for. They're going to end up in the URL bar. Why? If you are using method equals get for the form. That's how get works. It literally puts all of the HTTP parameters in the URL, which is wonderfully useful if it's sort of low-stakes stuff like the Google search box, or if it is, or potentially low-stakes stuff like the Google search box, or if you just want to be able to hyperlink directly to a URL like this. In other words, if I put this into an anchor tag, open bracket a href, and a URL like this, I could deep link a user to a web page that just always says hello, comma, David. So get strings contain all of the requisite information to render a page for the user. But this isn't really good for privacy. So recall that there's not only get, but there's also something called post. And post is just a different HTTP verb that essentially, with respect to those virtual envelopes last week, sort of puts the information more deeply inside of the envelope such that it's not written right there in the URL bar, but it's still accessible by the server. So if I do this, watch what happens. Let me go back into VS Code. Let me go back into index.html, which has the form. And let me quite simply change the method from get to post. And now let me go back to my other browser tab, back to the form, and reload so that the form knows that the method has changed. Now type in David and click greet. And before I do that, let me zoom in on the URL bar. Notice that the URL does change. I'm at /greet, but I haven't revealed to the world or to anyone with physical access to my browser what URL I just searched for. All they know is that I went to /greet, but not the key value pair or pairs that were passed in. Of course, this clearly hasn't worked. I've got an HTTP status code of 405, which means method not allowed. That's because Flask, by default, when defining routes, simply assumes that you want get instead of post. Now, get is good for the default page. In fact, when I go back here, this is equivalent to me visiting the / route just in the browser. So I want my index to generally support get. But the greet route should support post. And the simplest way to do this is to pass in another argument to the route function, which we haven't needed before because the default is get. And I can instead tell Flask a comma-separated list of the HTTP methods that I want this route to support. So if I wanted to support just post, I can pass in a list containing just post. And recall, Python uses square brackets for lists, which are their version of arrays in C. Now, by default, this argument is this, methods equals get, and that's why the only thing supported a moment ago was get. That's why I'm now changing it to be post instead. I have to make one other change, though. It turns out if you read the documentation, when accessing HTTP parameters via post instead of get, you move from using request.args to request.form. This is completely unintuitive that request.args is get and request.form is post because they all come from forms. So it's bad naming, admittedly. So you just kind of have to remember request.args is used for get, request.form is used for post. So all I need to do further is change this to be request.form. And that's it. Now my web application will support web forms submitting to it via post instead of get. Let me go ahead and type in my name now. I'll zoom in. Notice that the URL will again change to /greet with no parameters evident, but I will be greeted this time because the server knew to look deeper into that envelope for those key value pairs instead. And just to be now sort of diagnostic about this, let me go back once more. Let me right-click or control-click on my desktop and go to inspect. Here's where developer tools can be super useful as well. I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to go ahead and clear this. And now I'm going to type in David again, and I'm going to click greet. But because I have the network tab open, like we played with last week, it's going to show me all of the requests going from my browser to server, which is going to be useful here because not only do I see, OK, it obviously worked because I got back a 200, but if I click on this diagnostic output, I can actually go to the payload tab here, and I'll see that the form data that was submitted was name, the value of which was David. So you can see what you're submitting. So you can do this today. Like if you want to log into some website, Gmail or otherwise, you can actually see all of the data that your own keyboard is submitting to the server, even if it's using post, because the browser that you control, of course, can see the same there. All right. Any questions now on this transition from get to post? Kind of on a roll or not going so well? We'll see. All right, so what more can we do with this? Well, let's give ourselves a couple more building blocks before we transition to actually implementing some real-world problems, as I did years ago with one such example. Suppose that I don't like this direction I'm going in insofar as every time I have a page with a form, it submits to another route altogether. Because in your mind's eye, just kind of extrapolate. Well, if I have 2 forms on my page, I now need 4 routes. If I have 3 forms, I need 6 routes. It seems a little annoying that you use one route just to show the form and another route to process the form. This is going to get annoying over time because it's like twice as many routes as might be ideal. So is there a way to get kind of the best of both worlds and combine these 2 routes into one so that everything related to greeting the user all happens in one place? Well, you can, as follows. What I'm going to go ahead and do is delete my greet route altogether and most of my index route, but I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to first say that the methods that the index route support now shall be both get and post, as a comma separated list there. And then inside of my index route, I can simply ask a question of the form if the request that is submitted to the server has a method of post, then assume that form was submitted. This is just a Python comment, note to self that I'm going to come back to in a moment. Else, if the request method is not post, so I could technically say if elif request.method equals get, then, but this is kind of dumb because I only support 2 verbs, so I might as well just assume for efficiency else handles the get implicitly, then go ahead and assume that no form was submitted, so show form. So just notes to self as to what I want to do. So how do I show the form? Well, this line was easy. Return render template of index.html. If, though, the form was submitted, what do I want to do? Well, just as before, let's return render template greet.html, passing in a name value of request.form.get, quote unquote name, else a default value of world. So the exact same logic from each of the 2 functions a moment ago, but I've now combined them into one by just using some conditional logic and just asking the server if the user got here via post. Well, the only way they could have gotten here via post is by having clicked that button and submitted the form. So let's just go ahead and greet them. Else, if they got here via get by just typing in example.com or whatever the actual URL is, let's go ahead and show them the template. So it's still good design in that I have a separate template for each of these pieces of functionality. Go ahead and greet them. Else, if they got here via get by just typing in example.com or whatever the actual URL is, let's go ahead and show them the template. So it's still good design in that I have a separate template for each of these pieces of functionality that is only minimally different, but I'm sort of deciding which of those to show based on the actual logic in this here app. All right, so this is almost perfect, except for one bug. What else needs to change if I've just combined my greet route and this default slash route as well? Yeah. Yeah, so in the form that has index.html, recall that there's an action line that specifies, like, to what URL do you want to submit this? Well, let me go back to index.html. It can't be /greet anymore because that doesn't exist. So I'm just going to delete the word greet and submit it to / instead, which will have the effect of also just omitting it entirely. If you don't specify an action, it submits to the very location that it came from. But if you want to be pedantic and even more clear, just specifying that the action now of this form is just this, then that will work here too. All right, so let's test it. Let's go back to the other tab, back to the form, reload. It's blank now. I type in David, click greet, and this too is working. But again, if I go back and reload, get is working as well. But there's nothing ending up in the URL because I'm now using post, which again tends to be a good thing for privacy reasons as well. Let me show one final flourish before we transition to something real world motivated. If I go into app.py, for a while now, I've been passing in this default value of world, which is fine, especially if it's something short and sweet. That's the default value. But I can actually put a bit of conditional logic in my template as well. So in fact, let me go into greet.html and trust that I will now be passed in a name variable. But I can decide for myself in the template whether I want to say hello name, or if it's blank, hello world instead. And how might I do this? Well, I can always say hello. But then I'm going to use some Jinja syntax that we haven't seen yet. But it turns out in Jinja, the templating language that Flask uses, you can use Python-like syntax too. And you can ask questions like, well, if the name variable has a value, we'll then go ahead and output the value of that name. Else, if the name variable does not have a value, go ahead and output a literal value like world. And then down here, end if. So Jinja, again, is a little weird in that it says end block, end if, but that's the way it is. But even though this looks a little weird, it's just a nice, clever way of putting a bit of logic into my template. And if the name has a value, so it's not empty or none, go ahead and display it. Hence the curly braces, else go ahead and literally say world. Why is it not problematic? And you can see the dots here, that there's all of this white space after the word hello, comma. Like otherwise, this would seem to create quite a messy paragraph or phrase of text in terms of white space, but HTML ignores superfluous white space. So anything more than a single space just gets canonicalized or collapsed into a single space. And we saw that, recall, last week accidentally when I had those 3 paragraphs of text from the duck, but I wanted them deliberately to be separate paragraphs, and they weren't, because all of that white space was ignored until I actually introduced the paragraph tag instead. So this just moves some of that logic now to the templates. So for all this logic and more, here's the official documentation for Flask and specifically Jinja's own documentation. But for the most part, we've seen what's possible already. And I promised a real world example, so here now it is. So back when I took CS50 as a sophomore, there was no web programming in the class, and frankly, there was barely any web actually in the world, because it was all so new, HTML and the like. But it was my sophomore spring, maybe, or junior fall, that I also got involved in the freshman intramural sports program, or Frosh IMs for short. And back in the day, we would walk from, say, Matthews Hall to Wigglesworth, freshman year at least, to register for sports by filling out what was called a sheet of paper, and then you would go to the proctor's dorm room and slide it like under their door or through the mail slot, and that's how we registered for sports. It was sort of ripe for disruption before that was even a phrase. And so one of the very first projects I took on myself personally after taking CS50 was to figure out how web programming worked. And Python wasn't a thing yet, nor was half of the topics we've been talking about thus far. But at the time, I learned a programming language called Perl. I learned a little something about CSV files, which we did a couple of weeks back too. And I built this, the freshman intramural sports website, via which you could click on a bunch of links and get some information. But most importantly, you could register for sports, as by typing in your name, selecting the sport for which you want to register, click submit, and no longer walk across Harvard Yard with a piece of paper to actually register for sports. So we thought we'd use this as sort of the beginning of a motivation for how we can now solve problems using web-based interfaces using code, and also what not to do, like background images that repeat like this are not really in fashion anymore, nor arguably in 1997. But let's leave that as a cliffhanger and come back in 10 minutes after a snack with re-implementing the Frosh IM's website. All right. We are back. So among the goals now are to recreate the beginnings of a site like this for Frosh IMs, whereby we want to enable students to visit a form, fill out that form, and submit it to a server, and then register. And we'll dispense with all of the amazing graphics and such and keep it fairly simplistic and core HTML. So let's go ahead and do this. Back here in VS Code, I've gotten ready now for this next set of examples. And in particular, I've created in advance a directory called Frosh IM. Inside of which are app.py, requirements running again on port 5000. And then I'm going to go ahead and open up another terminal here, as I did before, cd into Frosh IMs in that terminal, where I'll see the exact same files. And I'll give you a quick tour of what I created in advance. So here in app.py is I get the server up and running again on port 5000. And then I'm going to go ahead and open up another terminal here, as I did before, cd into Frosh IMs in that terminal, where I'll see the exact same files, and I'll give you a quick tour of what I created in advance. So here in app.py is quite simply the simplest of applications that just renders the index.html template with an expectation in a moment that we're going to make it more interesting than that. Meanwhile, if I open my terminal again and open up requirements.txt, it just mentions Flask, but it's already installed, so no more to say about that. For now. Now let me go ahead lastly and open up templates, the templates folder, 2 files therein, the first of which is layout.html, which looks almost the same, except I did add a slightly more user-friendly tag to the head of the page, which you might not have seen before. But this is a tag that essentially you can copy and paste into templates of your own that help the content of a page resize to be mobile friendly. In fact, without this line, if you were to develop problem set 9 or your final project for the web and then try to access the site on a phone, everything might look quite a bit too small, font sizes and more. This line tends to help the browsers resize dynamically so that it actually matches the width of the device's own width. For instance, a phone versus a laptop or desktop. But otherwise, everything else is the same there, including the placeholder for the body block that I've defined here on line 9. Lastly, there's one more file that at the moment doesn't do anything all that interesting except is ready to contain the contents of the registration form for fraud. The width of the device's own width. For instance, a phone versus a laptop or desktop. But otherwise, everything else is the same there, including the placeholder for the body block that I've defined here on line 9. Lastly, there's one more file that at the moment doesn't do anything all that interesting. Except is ready to contain the contents of the registration form for Frosh IM. So let's go ahead and start with actually that. Let me quickly whip up a form that minimally gives the user something that they can submit to the server to register for sports, and then we'll improve upon it a bit iteratively. So here inside of the body of index.html, which is going to extend the actual layout, the blueprint we already created, I'm going to have a quick title for the page like register, just to make clear to the student what they need to do using the H1, which is the big and bold tag. Then I'm going to go ahead and have a form tag whose action is going to be anything I want. But since I want the user to register, I'm going to have it go to /register, which makes more sense semantically than greet now, because we're doing something else. The method I'm going to have the student use is post, if only because they don't want their roommates knowing what they visited in their browser. So this way it will tuck the HTTP parameters deeper in that virtual envelope, so it's not stored in the browser's history. Inside of this form, I'm going to have minimally an input box for the student's name. So I'll call that aptly name and set name equal to name in my HTML. The type of this text box will be exactly that, text. And then just to make it a little more user-friendly, I'm going to add a placeholder of name so they know what to do. I'm going to go ahead and turn off autocomplete in case multiple roommates want to sign in from the same computer or register from the same computer. And then we'll turn on autofocus to put the cursor in that name box. And then, and you didn't see this last week, but if you've ever wondered how drop-down menus are implemented in HTML, if you've never done this yourself, those drop-down menus on web pages are called select menus. And if I want the user to select a sport to register for, I'm going to call this input a sport. And this is an alternative to just having a generic text box where we have the students type in the sport they want to register for, which would be fraught with typographical errors and changes in capitalization. A drop-down menu, of course, standardizes what the human can select. So inside of this drop-down, I'm going to have a few options. The first of which will be basketball, for instance, the second of which will be soccer, and the third of which I think was the first three with which we debuted back in the day, was ultimate frisbee. Now, these option tags can take some attributes. By default, they will take on the value of whatever words are typed in between the open and close tags. But just to be pedantic, I'm going to make clear that the value of selecting this option shall be basketball, but I could change it to be something else if I so chose. The value of this selection will be soccer, and the value of this last option will be ultimate frisbee, just in case I want to store something else in my database ultimately. Now, that is a complete index.html, I think. So if I go back to my browser tab, which previously was showing me the hello program, because I stopped and restarted Flask, and you can stop Flask by just hitting Control-C for interrupting it. I'm going to reload the page, and I should now see, OK, a slightly more interesting form with a name box with the cursor is blinking there, and then a select menu, a drop-down with 3 options. Now, it's a little presumptuous of me to select basketball by default, and in fact, this is kind of inviting user error if they type in their name, don't really think about it, and now register for basketball accidentally. So I'm going to make a couple of improvements here. I'm actually going to have essentially a blank option at the top whose value is nothing, and I'm going to have it just labeled sport. And just to be super clear, I'm going to select this value by default. So the option tag in HTML supports not only a value attribute, but it turns out a selected attribute. Which, if present, means that's the option that will be selected by default. So if we go back now to this page and reload to get a new copy of the HTML, looks a little better. I still have the name select menu, a drop-down with 3 options. Now, it's a little presumptuous of me to select basketball by default. And in fact, this is kind of inviting user error if they type in their name, don't really think about it, and now register for basketball accidentally. So I'm going to make a couple of improvements here. I'm actually going to have essentially a blank option at the top whose value is nothing. And I'm going to have it just labeled sport. And just to be super clear, I'm going to select this value by default. So the option tag in HTML supports not only a value attribute, but it turns out a selected attribute, which if present means that's the option that will be selected by default. So if we go back now to this page and reload to get a new copy of the HTML, looks a little better. I still have the name at left, but the sport now menu looks like this. So it's a little more clear what I want them to do from this dropdown. And sport deliberately on the back end won't have a value. And theoretically, this will help me determine if they actually selected a sport or just clicked register and ignored the dropdown still. But I do need a way for them to register ideally by clicking a button. So I'm going to add a button, the type of which is submit. And then I'm going to have this button's label be register. So now if I go back to the form once more, reload, I now have, I think, a complete form, albeit not very pretty, via which David can register, for instance, here, what I want them to do from this dropdown. And sport deliberately on the back end won't have a value. And theoretically, this will help me determine if they actually selected a sport or just clicked register and ignored the dropdown still. But I do need a way for them to register ideally by clicking a button. So I'm going to add a button, the type of which is submit. And then I'm going to have this button's label be register. So now if I go back to the form once more, reload, I now have, I think, a complete form, albeit not very pretty, via which David can register, for instance, for basketball by clicking register. And, darn it, I have a 404 not found. But why is that? Why is nothing yet found? Why is /register not found? Yeah. What's that? I haven't linked the option to anything. I think the form has been linked. Whoops. The form is telling the browser to go to /register. So this is correct behavior. But if we go to app.py, there's no route defined for /register. So of course it's not found because there's an infinite number of routes that don't exist. And register is currently among those. So I can define that myself. I can say app.route, quote unquote, register. I do want to use post. So I need to proactively say that the methods this function will support will be indeed post instead of the default of get. I'm going to define an actual function to call when this route is used. And by convention, I'm going to call it just register, even though I could call it anything I want. And inside of my register function, well, for now, I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to at least just say, I'm going to at least check that the user has given me a name and a sport. So how can I express this? Well, because I've already imported the request global variable that comes with Flask, I can ask questions of it. And I can say something like, if it is not the case that request.form.getName has a value, or if it's the case that, or if it's not the case that request.form.getSport has a value, then let's go ahead and give the user a warning of sorts. I'll return render template of a file called failure.html. This doesn't exist yet, but no big deal. Let me go back into my terminal. Let me go into templates and create a file. If it's the case that, or if it's not the case that request.form.getSport has a value, then let's go ahead and give the user a warning of sorts. I'll return render template of a file called failure.html. This doesn't exist yet, but no big deal. Let me go back into my terminal. Let me go into templates and create a file called failure.html. And in this file, I'm going to say that it extends layout.html, and then it has a block body inside of which is going to be something like super trivial for now, just to get us going. And this failure page is simply going to say, you are not registered, exclamation point, and then end block. So that's it, just sort of an error page that now exists. I'm going to close it out of sight, out of mind. But I think this now will work. If it is not the case that the user gave us a name, or it's not the case that the user gave us a sport, we will show this error message. Otherwise, if all seems to be well, for now, we're not going to do anything useful with the information, but I'm going to go ahead and return render template of success.html, which is simply going to assume that the user was successfully registered. So let's whip that up quickly. I'm going to go ahead and code up success.html. Otherwise, if all seems to be well, for now, we're not going to do anything useful with the information, but I'm going to go ahead and return render template of success.html, which is simply going to assume that the user was successfully registered. So let's whip that up quickly. I'm going to go ahead and code up success.html. Inside of this file, which will similarly extend layout.html, inside of which there's a body block that quite simply says, how about you are registered? And we'll just pretend that it is so, end block. So that's it. In short, I wanted two templates that show failure or success, respectively. So I think now in app.py we're in better shape. I now have a register route that will get called if post is used to visit it. And I'm going to check request.form, which is where you get the post variables from, check whether name or sport is provided, and I'm going to render a template accordingly. So let's try this. Let me go back to my other tab and go back to the form. Let me type in my name, David, but no sport. Click register. And I have an internal server error, which was not intended. So let's figure out how to diagnose this. So it seems to be the case that I'm at /register. That was intended, but something clearly went wrong. So let's go back. Now, I could just kind of stare at my code endlessly, but recall that there should be some hints in my terminal window that's running Flask. So let me go back to my other terminal. And there it is, unexpected char double quote at line 11. Well, so sounds like user error. So that is in failure.html. And you can kind of see it. Because Flask is like underlining it literally for me. What did I do that was stupid? Yeah, I just didn't close my quote. So amateur hour here. So let me go into, I do need to open it after all, ironically. So let's go. Go ahead in my other terminal, open up failure.html, and there it is. One stupid character. Away from correctness. All right, let's close this again. Go back to the other tab. Let's try this again. David as my name, but no sport. Register. OK, you are not registered. I don't know why, but I know I'm not registered. Let's try it again with a name with no name, but yes, a sport, click register, you are not registered. All right, just for good measure, let's give no name and no sport, you are not registered. So that seems to be working. Let's now cooperate. Let's go ahead and register as David for basketball. Cross my fingers. Damn it. And internal server error. Let's try to learn from my past mistakes. Let's open up this. Eyeball it. I did it twice, even though that was not copy paste. So 0 for 2. All right, let's go back here. Notice now I can actually just click reload because the browser's smart enough to remember what I just posted to the server. So if I click reload, you'll be prompted to confirm the form submission, lest you be doing this on a website with your credit card or something where you don't want to send it twice. But in this case, I'm fine with sending my name and basketball twice. So I'm going to click continue. And this time it worked, telling me that I'm actually registered. So I'm not doing anything with the student's data, but at least I am validating that they gave me some input. Now there's a catch here. The catch, of course, with HTML is that it's all executed client side. And so for instance, suppose that a student is really upset that we only offer basketball, soccer, and ultimate frisbee, and maybe they really want to register for volleyball, even though we're not offering volleyball. Well, there's arguably like a security vulnerability here, where technically my code right now will tolerate any user input, even if it's not in that dropdown. Because after all, let me go ahead and right-click or control-click on my web page and open up the developer tools. Let me go into the form as sort of a hacker-type student. Let me go into the select menu. And OK, no big deal. If I want ultimate frisbee to exist, well, I just need to know a little HTML. I'm going to right-click on that element and click Edit as HTML. This literally lets me start editing the HTML of the page. I'm going to give myself my own option. Option value equals volleyball. Close bracket, volleyball, enter. And now, when I close developer tools, woohoo, I can register for volleyball if I want. So let's select volleyball, type in maybe Kelly is hacking the site, register, and she is registered for volleyball apparently. All right, so the short answer is, the takeaway here is, do not trust user input, ever, for reasons we've already seen when we discuss SQL, ever more so now that we're dealing with the web, because who knows what users are going to do accidentally, foolishly, or even in Kelly's case here, maliciously, trying to pass data that we did not expect. So what would be the defense against this? Like, this is just how HTML works, and assume that I'm actually registering Kelly for sports now, and somehow she's now signed up for volleyball in our database. What would a solution be logically here? Yeah. Yeah, so maybe do some server-side validation. So don't just blindly check that we have a value from the user. Actually check that it's one of those sports. So if I go back to app.py, I could do this in a few ways. And maybe my first instinct would be this. Let's check for the name and do this. But let's also do this. Like if request.form.get quote-unquote sport. And actually, let's put this in a variable just to make it even easier to type. So sport equals this. If sport, how about does not not equal, what was it, basketball, and sport does not equal soccer, and sport does not equal, quote unquote, ultimate frisbee, then render an error. So return render template, quote unquote, failure.html. So now if I go back to this form and try to register as Kelly again, you are not registered. So I somehow caught her because volleyball, of course, is not in the list of sports that I put there. But what might you not like about this approach? Even if you've never done web stuff before, what's bad about this? Yeah, I have to hard code every single sport now in not only app.py to check for the validity on the server of what the human is typed in, but recall that the dropdown itself came from index.html. So I now in duplicate have to put like all of the sports there too. So like this just seems bad to have duplication. And so better might be to do something more like this. At the top of my file here, why don't I go ahead and just give myself a global variable, which in the context of this web app is perfectly reasonable, so I can access it anywhere. Let's call it sports in all caps, just to connote that this is a global variable and constant, even though Python does not have consts in the sense that C does. But this is sort of on the honor system. If you see a variable in all caps like this, just don't mess with it. Use it, but don't mess with it. So inside of the square brackets, this is going to be a list of the sports that I do want to support. So basketball, comma, soccer, comma, ultimate frisbee. And that's it. Now, instead of doing all of this, what I can instead ask is a simpler question like this. If sport not in sports, then go ahead and return render template, quote unquote, failure.html. And I can actually tighten this up a little bit. I don't need two calls to failure.html. Why don't I just borrow this code and say, or sport not in sports, render a failure. And now I've tightened this up quite a bit more. But I'm essentially using Python to just ask, is the sport that, oops, sorry, I deleted too much, sport equals actually, let's just tighten it up further. Sport does not exist, so let's do request.form.get, quote unquote, sport. So if the sport that the human typed in or selected from the dropdown somehow is not in this global list of possible sports, well, then it's a failure. Don't let Kelly or whoever register instead. But if I now have this global variable, I can be a bit smarter in my template. I don't need to manually write out all three of these sports here. Instead, I think I can be smart about this. And when I render index.html itself, why don't I just pass in a variable called sports, for instance, set it equal to the value of that global array, and then in my template, and here's where I just pass in a variable called sports, for instance, set it equal to the value of that global array, and then in my template, and here's where templating again gets interesting and starts to save you time, let me go into index.html, delete all but the default value, the blank one, and do something like this. Jinja, it turns out, also supports loops like Python. For sport in sports, using the curly braces and the % signs, I can now dynamically generate options, as many as I want. So option value equals quote unquote the current sport, close quote there, close bracket, sport. So it's a little redundant, but again, this is just how HTML is. This is what the human sees. This is the value that gets submitted to the server in case you want one to differ from the other. And then below that option line, I can say end for, which is a bit weird, but that's how it works in Jinja, to stop that loop. So this is kind of powerful. Now if I have 3 sports, 30 sports, all of the options will be dynamically generated by this template. And so now we're starting to save ourselves time, and I can centrally manage all the sports by just updating this global list here in app.py. So let's go back to the browser, back to the form, and I can centrally manage all the sports by just updating this global list here in app.py. So let's go back to the browser, back to the form, reload, and you'll see that the dropdown, thankfully, still works the same way, but all of those options were dynamically generated. Indeed, if I view page source from my browser, you'll see, and there's some extra white space there because the loop was adding some white space on each iteration, I still have the 3 sports, but not volleyball, as was my intention. So now if Kelly even tries hacking this version of the site by going in here and typing in volleyball manually and registering, the logic will still catch it because only those 3 sports are in that array. So it's perfectly fine for me now to register for basketball because it's among the sports, sorry, in that list, not array. Questions on any of these here techniques? All right, how about another type of form? So select menus are nice, but you also might see radio buttons on websites, which are the mutually exclusive little circles that you can select to choose one or another option. Let me go back to index.html and just show you how those can be created as well. Instead of using a select menu, turns out
Oh my god, my mic's been off. I did not know that. I just explained a whole lot of... Yeah. Oops. Oh man, my ADD is not working with me today. Oh, yeah, we got a new display shelf. And, well, it's my grandma's. My grandma gave us hers. And it, like, wraps around the bed. Yeah, it looks awesome. Whatever, she's trying to steal my grandma. But... But it's got this cool thing where, like, when you touch this little metal piece, it turns the lights on and off. It's not like a button. It's just like a touch thing.
There's no stealing. She's my grandma.
Oh, my God.
He got all upset about it. He's like, you can't steal my grandma. And then Felicia was on the other phone. She goes, oh, what? I want that grandma. And she goes, I'm everybody's grandma. He's like, no, she's my grandma.
Well, don't be telling people that.
He got very
This is my grandma.
Oh, my God. That's
like
my
that.
grandma.
That is my grandma.
Oh my
Oh
god.
my goodness.
That is my grandma.
You're crazy.
Let her know. Everybody's fighting over her.
Well,
Yeah?
everybody trying to steal my grandma.
Give me grandma.
Give me grandma.
Give me grandma. This is my grandma. Yeah, that.
Jesus. Crazy. Yeah. Let's see. I'm learning about Flask on this thing. Is that how you say it? Flask? Flask. I think it's just Flask. It's not a Flask, but it's makes HTML, I guess, easier to implement Python in HTML. So here I have Python, but then, yeah, so I had to import Flask, because I think I have to use Flask to use Python. I'm not positive, but yeah. And then, but I know the other thing that makes it easy is, like, instead of having to write out the whole HTML, like, syntax, I can create a layout, so I don't have to put all this, and then in here, I can just put that, and it's like, imports what's right here into this. So it makes it easier. It's nice. But learning. Flask, yeah. Not like a drinking flask, but yeah. It's an interesting name they chose. It was cool. What? I'll grab one chip. Calm down. I'm gonna knock my coffee over. Okay. Are you growling at me? You're silly. Alright. Yeah, back in. Yeah, I heard it was back end or framework for. Yeah, I said framework. Yeah, because I think it says back end, and then he said it was a framework design, which I don't. I guess what that means is it's like. I mean, that's just what it does. So HTML is the front end, and then that's the back end. But I'm also like, so is JavaScript's front end or back end? Because technically JavaScript isn't. I don't know. I mean, that doesn't like that mean that JavaScript is back end, because it's not the stuff you visually see. But then like something like CSS, is that front end? Because that's the visual stuff, right? So, I don't know. It's very confusing. I don't know the definitions for everything, but it's a framework for websites, yeah. But still trying to entirely understand the difference between the front end and back end. But I don't know if like the front end's just visual and like the back end's just like getting stuff to work properly, like giving it functions, like using buttons to get to a place, or like defining stuff, or giving like values and stuff. I mean, I guess it depends on what you're using, but obviously HTML is the front end work. But I don't know if JavaScript is technically front end or back end. It sounds like it would be back end in those situations, but I don't know.
We can create a whole bunch of inputs of radio type as follows, of radio button type as follows. For each sport, so for sport, create a whole
He just
bunch
did
of
something
inputs.
again? Man, he's changing. He's like showing so many different ways to do this. Okay, so he just got rid of the entire select. Are you serious?
Radio type as follows, of radio button type as follows. For each sport, so for sport, in sports, let's go ahead and output in between this tag and the N4 the following. Input type equals radio, and let's give it a name. The name of this radio button is going to be sports, and the value of the current input is going to be quote unquote sports. And the word that the human's going to see is, as before, sport. So notice it's just another type of input. Previously, we've seen text, for instance, 2 lines above. We also saw last time search. We saw email. There's a bunch of text input types. This one, though, is going to display as a radio button instead, and the human is going to see this label here. If I now go back to my other browser tab and click back, click reload on the form, I should see it's not pretty, but it's a radio button display as a radio button instead, and the human is going to see this label here. If I now go back to my other browser tab and click back, click reload on the form, I should see it's not pretty, but it's a radio button in the sense that these are mutually exclusive. How does the browser know that I should only be allowed to select one of them? Well, because I use the same name.
Let's see. Okay, so you can pick one of the, oh, that's how they do that. Okay.
For each of those radio buttons. It knows that means mutual exclusivity. In fact, if I view page source in the browser, you'll see that all 3 of the inputs that were dynamically generated, type equals radio, type equals radio, type equals radio, also have identical names. And so that's just how that works. And that's the only change necessary. If I now go ahead and type in my name, David Basketball, click register, we're still up and running. Because what the server gets is still exactly the same. Inside of request.form, they can access, you can still access name or sport no matter what type it was in the user's own browser. Questions on these techniques? All right, well, it's kind of obnoxious that when you don't do something right in this website, like forget your name but do select a sport, all you are told is generically you are not registered. Like, it'd be nice and much more user-friendly, better UX, user experience, so to speak, to actually tell the user what's wrong so they can actually fix the problem. Now, there's a bunch of ways we can do this, but I'm going to propose that we go ahead and do this. Let's create a template called error.html, whose purpose in life is just to tell the user a little something more about what they did wrong. So I'm going to go back into my terminal window here. I'm going to code up a file called error.html, enter, and I'm going to go ahead and as before, extend layout.html, learning from my past mistakes and closing that quote. Then I'm going to go ahead and do body block down here, and then inside of this block body, I'm going to go ahead and have just some simple text, like an H1 tag that just says error to the user, then a paragraph tag that's going to contain some error message to be determined, and then that's it for now. So I've got the template for an error message screen. Let me go back into app.py now, and let me add some logic, because app.py does know what's wrong. It's just like an H1 tag. Tag that just says error to the user, then a paragraph tag that's going to contain some error message to be determined.
Okay. Okay, take the bag, throw it in the trash. Here, take the bag. Put it in the trash. You're eating them all anyways. Oh my god. I'm gonna get in trouble.
And then that's it for now. So I've got the template for an error message screen. Let me go back into app.py now, and let me add some logic, because app.py does know what's wrong. It's just at the moment we're very generically returning a failure template instead of something more precise. But if I know that the user hasn't given me their name, well, let me say that error message. So let's actually get rid of these 2 lines and be a little more specific, like this. So if, or how about let's do it like this. How about validate the user's name first. So name equals request.form.get quote unquote name. That just gives me a variable containing the user's name. If they didn't give me a name, which I can express with just if not name, like if name is blank or none, then let me go ahead and return render template of that error template, but let's pass in a specific message like missing name. And so by passing in another argument to this template, called message, I can trust that Flask will dynamically output that message where I tell it to using the old curly braces. Meanwhile, let's go ahead and validate not just the name, but validate sport. I can do this in a couple of ways. Let's do this. So sport equals request.form.get quote unquote sport. Then in here, let's say if there's no sport, go ahead and return render template quote unquote error.html comma message equals missing sport. So quite like name. But we can be more specific now too. If the sport they did give me is not in the global sports list, well then it's Kelly trying to register for volleyball again. So let's return render template of error.html, but this time the message shall be invalid sport or something like that. So we're being ever more clear. Otherwise, they are presumably confirmed because we got this far logically. So if I go back to the other browser tab, go back to the form, and let's go ahead and type in no name and just click register. Okay, what did I do wrong accidentally? So let's go back to VS Code, open my terminal, open the first terminal window where Flask run is running, encountered unknown tag body. So I did something stupid in error.html. So let's go into error.html, and we can be more specific now too. If the sport they did give me is not in the global sports list, well then it's Kelly trying to register for volleyball again, so let's return render template of error.html, but this time the message shall be invalid sport or something.
I feel like it's gonna come up with like a different way to do this besides this.
Oh, damn.
What?
That Daniel dude, he's like, because I posted that truck, I was like, who's gonna buy this for me? He's like, I'm buying this for myself. That's a C10. It's like, damn, I shouldn't have posted it.
I shouldn't have told anyone.
Alright. It's like, don't talk about people.
Like that.
Give it
So
to
we're
me.
being ever more clear. Otherwise, they are presumably confirmed because we got this far logically.
Okay.
So if I go back to the other browser tab, go back to the form, and let's go ahead and type in no name and just click register. Okay, what did I do wrong accidentally? So let's go back to VS Code, open my terminal, open the first terminal window where Flask run is running, encountered unknown tag body. So I did something stupid in error.html. So let's go into error.html.
Body.
And body.
No tag body.
Oh, it's subtle.
Is it the space?
I just transposed the words. It's supposed to be block body. That was dumb. All right, block body. I think.
Oh. Wait.
That's correct. So let's go back to the browser. Let's reload. It's prompting me to reconfirm that I want to submit the exact same form, which recall had no name and no sport, but now I see an error in a good way. This is not a server error. This is my error, missing name. Now it's not super user-friendly, but it's at least more explanatory than you are not registered. All right, let's go back.
Oh,
Let's
good
give it a
night,
name,
man.
but no sport.
Yeah, I forgot
Register.
you're on the other side of the world.
Missing sport. Let's go back. Let's go ahead and give it a sport, but no name. Missing name as before. And if I took the time to actually hack the HTML and do what Kelly did before and add volleyball, it would similarly say invalid sport in this case too, because it's not in that same list. All right.
We go Frito.
Questions on this technique? All right, well, it's all fine and good to have a registration site that does this, but it's literally just throwing out the information. And what I did like years ago was actually even cut a corner initially where I think I wrote code that just sent an automatic email to the proctor running Frosh IMs containing the person's name and the sport for which they registered, but that was very quickly replaced by a better feature, which is actually store the data in the server itself and keep track of it rather than just send it off by email.
So
let's do a first pass at actually storing information on everyone who is registered for sports. Well, let me go up here and let me create another global variable to make my life easier here called registrants and set this equal to curly brace, close curly brace. What do these two characters represent? If empty,
library.
Especially. What data type is this?
Library.
It's a dictionary, so it's a pipe-spawn dict. So you could similarly say dict explicitly, open paren, close paren, but it's more Pythonic generally to just use two curly braces. This is just giving me an empty dictionary. Why? Well, I want to store the two things I'm collecting about all of the students, their name and the sport for which they registered. So key, value, name, sport. So how can I go about doing this? Well, it's pretty trivial. Down here in my register function, recall that I'm just kind of naively saying, you're registered, even though I'm not doing anything with their name or sport. But that's easy. Let's remember the student for real now. So in that registrants dictionary, let's go ahead and index into it using the student's name, David or Kelly or whoever, and set that equal to the sport for which they registered. And now notice the name is coming as before from request.form.get. The sport is similarly coming from that function, and so this is just remembering that key value pair. So that's all fine and good. It's in the computer's memory. How do we actually see it? Well, wouldn't it be nice after you register if you could see the actual registrants of the website? Certainly if you're the proctor trying to run the sports. Well, yes. So let's go down here and let's create another route like /registrants, which is just going to give me a list of everyone who's registered. Let's define a function called registrants, though I could call it anything I want. And this one's going to be relatively simple. Let's render a template called registrants, which will soon exist, and pass in all of the registrants that are in that global dictionary. And again, I can call this placeholder anything I want, but insofar as it contains the registrants, I'm setting registrants equal to the registrants global dictionary. So let's go now into my terminal window and create two registrants, which will soon exist, and pass.
Okay, so we're creating, yeah, that's what I was thinking. We're going to create a file. I didn't think it was going to be HTML, but well, I guess it has to be HTML for it to be viewed on the website.
Pass in all of the registrants that are in that global dictionary. And again, I can call this placeholder anything I want, but insofar as it contains the registrants, I'm setting registrants equal to the registrants global dictionary. So let's go now into my terminal window and create registrants.html and create really the beginnings of an actual Frosh IM's website that's going to show the proctor who has now registered. So let me go into this terminal and do code of registrants.html and close the terminal. Let's try to get this right finally. Extends layout.html, close quote, close bracket there. Then let's do block body in the right order, then end block down here, and then inside of the block here, this is going to be a bit more of a mouthful, but let's use some of our HTML from last week. We'll give an h1 tag that says registrants, so the proctor knows what they're looking at. Then let's put this in a table, for instance, with two columns, names and sports. So table tag followed by a t-head tag for the table heading. Then that heading is going to contain just a single row for TR, and each of those has a TH, table heading, one of which, and actually I'll make it tighter, is name, the other of which is going to be sport. So these are the column headings, the table headings, TH tags for short. After the head of the table, let's go ahead and do a T body for table body, and inside of here, this is where Jinja comes in use. I can say for each name in the registrants placeholder that was plugged in, and 4 proactively. What do I want to do on each iteration? Well, I think I want to output table row, table row, table row. And in here I can do tr, and then inside of that a table data for the cell on the left, putting in the student's name, which is coming from this for loop, just like in Python, and then one more table data, namely the registrant's placeholder indexed into at that name, which, because it's a dictionary, will give me the sport for that student's name. And then I think we're good to go. And in fact, just to hark back to something I said last week when we were imagining, actually this is in week 5, when we were talking about.
Oh yeah, end it.
About stacks, and like your Gmail or Outlook inbox is essentially a stack.
Wait, I didn't do this right. Body name of registrants, TR. Okay, this needs to go on the outside of TR. And then within TR, create P. And then this will pull the information for the actual name. And this will pull input. But that won't put in the sport, will it? Or will it?
With the newest emails on top, and I hypothesized at the time that it's just row after row after row after row when we started talking last week about HTML. Here is what Google and Microsoft and others are probably doing anytime you have tabular information in a page. They've got some data in memory, like the registrants, and they're just using code like this in Jinja to output table row, table row, table row. Imagine this is your email instead, same exact idea. And now we have the ability to express that kind of logic. So let's go back now into the browser. Click reload on the form. Let's register, for instance, David for basketball. Click register. It claims I'm registered, but hopefully now I'm legitimately registered because that variable is storing it in memory. And in fact, let's go ahead and go now to not /register, but I'll zoom in at the top, registrants, and hit enter, and we will see a very ugly but functional HTML table containing 2 columns, name and sport.
Didn't work for me. Registrants, nope. Registrants. Look how that word's like, so. Let's see.
Well.
Where's my error? Send templates. Registrants to HTML. Syntax unexpected, and where's that at in the HTML? I have, where did it say it was? Line 19 right here. Oh, there. Woohoo!
The so-called T-head, in which David and basketball are present. Moreover, if we now go back to that form, and let's try registering Kelly, for instance, for soccer, click register. Now let's manually go to registrants again. Now Kelly and David are in the server's memory as well. Questions then on what this example is now doing or how it's achieving these results? Yeah?
Doesn't that mean anybody?
Really good question. If you wanted to restrict the registrants page to only certain people, ideally you would have a password on it. And in fact, one of the next examples we'll do in a few minutes is a login page for exactly that reason. Right now, just sort of on the honor system that only the proctor in question goes to this URL. But just for the sake of discussion, actually, suppose that you did want the registration list to be public, if only to like hype up who is already registered. Well, it's not good to just tell people go to the /registers URL. We can actually link them to that in a few different ways. So for instance, I can go down to, how about, let's say, success.html. So let me open up success.html. It just says you are registered. I can do something like this, href equals /registrants. So I have control now over my HTML and the routes, so /registrants will exist. See who else registered, period. So this will create a nice little HTML link that links me to that route. So let's try this. So let's go back to the form over here. Let's go ahead and register John for Ultimate Frisbee and register. All right, and now we see you are registered, see who else registered. And if I hover over this, it's super small, but it would have showed me in the bottom left corner the link. And indeed, here now is John at the bottom of this table. And just to be clear, if I view page source on the browser, you see all of the TRs that we dynamically generated on the server side before they were sent as such to the browser. All right. What if we wanted to do something slightly more elegant here? Well, I don't have to just use this HTML hack. Like, why don't I just show the user who has registered automatically? And this is kind of a cool feature of web apps as well. In addition to importing Flask, render template, and request, I'm going to also import a function called redirect that comes with Flask. And indeed, rather than just show success.html, I'm going to go ahead and return the result of redirecting the user to /registrants. So to be clear, I'm in my register route, and instead of showing them the success page anymore, which I might as well delete at this point, I'm just going to redirect them to this list of everyone who is registered, including themselves. So if I go back over here and type in someone like Doug, who maybe will play basketball with me, and it's going to redirect them to this list of everyone who is registered, including themselves. So if I go back over here and type in someone like Doug, who maybe will play basketball with me, and click register, watch what happens to the URL at the very top of the screen. I'm automatically whisked away to registrants in this case. I made a change to the code though, and so the server actually was smart enough to reload. So Doug is now the only one in the database, and this actually hints at a problem we should really solve. Like, in fact, let's do this real fast. Let me go ahead and register myself again for basketball. Register. Now it's Doug and David. The catch, though, is if this server ever goes offline, maybe because it needs to be updated, or it crashes, or it reboots, when you hit Control-C and get back to your terminal, Flask server is no longer running, which means that global...
Well, my redirect isn't working. Hold on. Redirect.
Like, why don't I just show the user who has registered automatically? And this is kind of a cool feature of web apps as well. In addition to importing Flask, render template.
I'll take that away.
In request, I'm going to also import a function called redirect that comes with Flask. And indeed, rather than just show success.html, I'm going to go ahead and return the result of redirecting the user to /.
Oh, he deleted this one. Okay. That's why. Okay. Yeah.
/registrants. So to be clear, I'm in my register route, and instead of showing them the success page anymore, which I might as well delete at this point, I'm just going to redirect them to this list of everyone who is registered, including themselves. So if I go back over here and type in someone like Doug, who maybe will play basketball with me, and click register, watch what happens to the URL at the very top of the screen. I'm automatically whisked away to registrants in this case. I made a change to the code though, and so the server actually was smart enough to reload, so Doug is now the only one in the database, and this actually hints at a problem we should really solve. Like, in fact, let's do this real fast. Let me go ahead and register myself again for basketball. Register, now it's Doug and David. The catch though is if this server ever goes offline, maybe because it needs to be updated, or it crashes, or it reboots, when you hit Control-C and get back to your terminal, Flask server is no longer running, which means that global variable called registrants in all caps is gone. It's like free, the memory has been freed. So if I were to rerun Flask now, as would happen automatically if the server itself rebooted, well, this is not great because if I go back to the registrants page and click reload, no one has registered. And in fact, that's what happened with Doug a moment ago. Because I changed my actual app.py, Flask was smart enough to realize, oh wait, the code has changed, I better reload the program, which gave me a brand new version of that global dictionary. So what would be better, clearly, than storing registrants in memory, in RAM, in a variable in the server?
Like we were using SQL for.
Yeah. Yeah, so in an actual database. And so here's two where everything kind of comes full circle and connects again. So let me go back into app.py here. And I like generally the logic of what I've done. I don't like the fact that I'm just storing my registrants inside of this global variable, which is, again, just in the computer's volatile memory. Let's actually put this in a database instead. So let me go up here and get rid of this global dictionary. And let me do something a little smarter up here. Let me import from CS50's own library the SQL function that we've used before. And again, even though we've been taking off almost all of CS50's training wheels, the reality is using CS50's SQL library, even through final projects, just makes using SQL in Python so much easier. But there's certainly third-party libraries you can use. Let me go down now, and in addition to creating my app, let's create a database, DB for short, setting that equal to SQLite, and then SQLite : ///, which is not a typo, and let's assume that the database shall be called froshims.db. More on that in a moment. And then down here, now that I have a database variable, let's not remember the equal to SQLite, and then SQLite : ///, which is not a typo, and let's assume that the database shall be called froshims.db. More on that in a moment. And then down here, now that I have a database variable, let's not remember the student by storing them in this dictionary. Let's actually execute a line of SQL. So db.execute, insert into, well, wait a minute, what am I going to insert them into? Not to worry, I came prepared for this, so let me go ahead and maximize my terminal window and then run SQLite3 of a file called froshims.db. And this is a file I made in advance, but it's super simple. In fact, if I type .schema, just to see the design of this database, you'll see.
Ooh, buddy, we were on a fast now. Oh, I gotta code in SQLite, right? No, I don't.
Into, well, wait a minute, what am I going to insert them into? Not to worry, I came prepared for this, so let me go ahead and maximize my terminal window and then run SQLite 3 of a file called frostims.db. And this is a file I made in advance, but it's super simple. In fact, if I type .schema, just to see the design of this database, you'll see that in advance, I created a table in this database called registrants. It has a column called ID, a column called name, and a column called sport. And the primary key of this table is to use the ID value, which is just an integer. And now notice I have some constraints here. I want
Craig. Oh, God dang it. Okay, so I created a table, and then what I gotta create like a column. God dang it! Forgot how to create the fucking. Ugh.
Get down. Get down now. You're making a mess.
Oh, I have to. Do I type it like that?
Go. Now. You know better. You stay there. I'm very disappointed in you. You're lucky you're not in timeout right now.
What happened?
She started dumping the chip crumbs everywhere.
Oh.
Everywhere. Heard me. Disappointed. I don't even know what we're gonna do with this. Found it.
it's 230 thick.
Yeah, then after I do that, I gotta stop and go pick up the test. I was looking at rings.
Yeah.
We want to really save money on our wedding rings. We could get silver wedding bands.
Yeah.
I mean, silver. Yeah, and I like silver. And we could get better quality silver. We could get brand new wedding rings.
Really?
Yeah, we could get James Avery nice wedding rings for like $150. Instead of fucking $400 a ring.
Yeah. We really want gold. I mean, we can like upgrade one day,
Yeah,
but
we could go to the James Avery store and like go ring it out and get bougie with it. Or we could get it online. I found the ones online for like fucking 50 to $100.
yeah. Should we do that? Because honestly, I always stuff like costs a lot of money. Or are we just like,
No, we do our 5 or 10 year. We could get different rings if we
right?
want.
Yeah.
And
Sounds good.
silver's a sturdy metal and it's not gonna change color.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fine.
I like it better than the titanium one.
Yeah, me too. Oh no. Dang it.
You wanna go to the James Avery store today?
The what?
James Avery store.
Yeah, we can.
Pick up sativa. Pick up sativa and we're already in that area.
Yeah.
It's almost time to pick up your child.
You want me to drive? I like that shirt on you. It's really good. Do you wear shirts, Alexa?
Let's see. How much longer do I have in this?
All's fine.
Yeah, I still got another hour on this video. this Alexa. Talk too much. Let's see.
Sure. Please tell me your mom's name exactly as it appears in your address book.
What?
Alexa, stop. You can just buy
Alexa, stop.
right now for $8. Boom.
Oh, really?
Not for very long, but
$8.
$8. You really want a
Jesus.
cheap wedding? Let's go. I'm down for whatever, honestly. At this point, you my forever boo. Our 10-year though, our 10-year is gonna be a destination wedding, and we'll take all the kids. You down?
Oh, yeah.
10-year anniversary wedding. We almost made it a year already. And we haven't even done a wedding with it yet. Hope you still feel the same way in 20 years, motherfucker.
Yeah. Let's see.
Well, it said blood in, blood out, but there's no blood out. It's forever.
Mm.
You still streaming?
Yeah.
You coming with?
I can.
Pick up Cora, then Sativa, because she gets out early today. Then our wedding rings.
Yeah.
Kind of need your finger.
Yeah.
Unless you want me to take it now. Can't guarantee the ring will fit the same after that.
Well.
You know, bloating and all.
Yep.
Possible scar tissue. Oh God, I was so tired. Oh yeah, I only got like 2 hours of sleep. Getting all these random invites now. Oh shit, I forgot. It's
Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay. Create table. See.
we gotta go.
Oh, is it time to leave now?
Yeah, I remember. Alexa said, "Oh, almost time to pick up the kids."
You wanna go get Cora real quick?
And then come back.
Yeah.
Okay.
You as well.
No.
Alright, so we'll create a table called registrants. And then we'll put it in quotes. Put a space. And then I need to put. Okay. guess I don't need a primary key. Oh, she did fall asleep. No, it's null, so it has to be filled. Sport, text, it's null. Primary key. Oh, this is where you put the primary key. Put it at the end. I don't know if you put it like that. Okay. Alright, so there it is. So I created a table. Alright. With the ID integer, name, sports. Okay.
I want the user to give me a name and a sport, so I've specified that it's not just text, it's not null. That is, null values should not be possible to put in here. All right, so let me go ahead and exit out of SQLite 3. Let me go back into...
how do you... God dang it. How do you quit? Like this? I think that was for that other thing. Oh yeah, that was how you did, okay.
My code editor here, and now I know what to insert into. Insert into the table called registrants what?
Okay. DB. Oh no, wait, no, that's down here. Yeah. Okay.
Well, I want to insert how about a name of the student and the sport for which they registered, and the values, therefore, that I want to insert are going to be whatever they came from the post request. Here's where you do not want to make yourself vulnerable to SQL injection attacks. No F strings in here, no just plugging the student's input in blindly. This is where and why we use these placeholders in both CS50's library and in many libraries in the real world to specify that I want the library to properly sanitize the user's input and get rid of any scary characters like apostrophes or semicolons or the like. So I'm going to pass in name and sport. And this one line has the effect of, as you recommended, storing the registration in an actual database on the server, not just in volatile temporary memory. But we do have to change one thing. This line here is no longer valid because there's no global variable there via which we can get all of the registrants. But that's no big deal. Here's how most web apps would do this. I'm going to define a variable called registrants and set it equal to db execute of select star from registrants. It's as easy as that to just get all of the registrants from my... my database. And down here, there's no longer an all capitalized variable, but there is a lowercase one, registrants. So to be clear, in my register route, I am inserting the user into the database, and in my registrants route, I am selecting the users from the database. And then the rest of the code, I think, can stay the same. So let's go back to FroshAMs here, go back to the form, let's register David for basketball, register.
Well, I had a different situation happen, so does not exist FroshAMs DB. What I put FroshAMs DB? Oh, because I didn't call it that, did I? I called it... No, it's right there. Oh, but it needs to be in templates, right? Dang it. No, it's already in templates. Is it not supposed to be in templates?
I did screw up. You're seeing some weirdness here. What are you actually seeing? There's one user registered, not intentional.
Well, I did something wrong. Control from it here. Dang it. Boy, what are you doing, dude? God dang, sound gross. Jesus Christ. Disgusting. I mean, I created the table. It's in templates. Frost gems, that's what it's called, right? Frost DB. Something's wrong.
Into my code editor here, and now I know what to insert into. Insert into the table called registrants what? Well, I want to insert how about name of the student and the sport for which they registered, and the values therefore that I want to insert are going to be whatever they came from the post request. Here's where you do not want to make yourself vulnerable to SQL injection attacks. No F strings in here, no just plugging the student's input in blindly. This is where and why we use these placeholders in both CS50's library and in many libraries in the real world to specify that I want the library to properly sanitize the user's input and get rid of any scary characters like apostrophes or semicolons or the like. So I'm going to pass in name and sport. And this one line has the effect of, as you recommended, storing the registration in an actual database on the server, not just in volatile temporary memory. But we do have to change one thing. This line here is no longer valid because there's no global variable there via which we can get all of the registry characters like a pop into the table called registrant, column called sport, and the primary key of this table is to use the ID value, which is just an integer. And now notice I have some constraints here. I want the user to give me a name and a sport, so I've specified that it's not just text, it's not null. That is, null values should not be possible to put in here. All right, so let me go ahead and exit out of SQLite 3. Let me go back into, let me import from CS50's own library the SQL function that we've used before. And again, even though we've been taking off almost all of CS50's training wheels, the reality is using CS50's SQL library, even through final projects, just makes using SQL in Python so much easier, but there's certainly third-party libraries you can use. Let me go down now, and in addition to creating my app, let's create a database, DB for short, setting that equal to SQLite, and then SQLite : ///, which is not a typo, and let's assume that the database shall be called froshims.db. More on that in a moment. And then
it's not fucking working.
Down here, now that I have a database variable, let's not remember the student by storing them in this dictionary. Let's actually execute a line of SQL. So db.execute, insert into, well, wait a minute, what am I going to insert them into? Not to worry, I came prepared for this, so let me go ahead and maximize my terminal window and then run SQLite 3 of a file called froshims.db. And this is a file I made in advance, but it's super simple. In fact, if I type .schema, just to see the design of this database, you'll see that in advance I created a table in this database called registrants. It has a column called ID, a column called name, and a column called sport, and the primary key of this table is to use the ID value, which is just an integer. And now notice I have some constraints here. I want the user to give me a name and a sport, so I've specified that it's not just text, it's not null. That is, null values should not be possible to put in here. All right, so let me go ahead and exit out of SQLite 3. Let me go back into my code editor here, and now I know what to insert into. Insert into the table called registrants what? Well, I want to insert how about a name of the student and the sport for which they registered, and the values therefore that I want to insert are going to be whatever they came from the post request. Here's where you do not want to make yourself vulnerable to SQL injection attacks. No F strings in here, no just plugging the student's input in blindly. This is where and why we use these placeholders in both CS50's library and in many libraries in the real world to specify that I want the library to properly sanitize the user's input and get rid of any scary characters like apostrophes or semicolons or the like. So I'm going to pass in name and sport. And this one line has the effect of, as you recommended, storing the registration in an actual database on the server, not just in volatile temporary memory. But we do have to change one thing. This line here is no longer valid because there's no global variable there via which we can get all of the registrants, but that's no big deal. Here's how most web apps would do this. I'm going to define a variable called registrants and set it equal to db execute of select star from registrants. It's as easy as that to just get all of the registrants from my database. And down here, there's no longer an all capitalized variable, but there is a lowercase one, registrants. So to be clear, in my register route, I am inserting the user into the database, and in my registrants route, I am selecting the users from the database. And then the rest of the code I think can stay the same. So let's go back to Frosh AMs here, go back to the form, let's register David for basketball, register. Ah, I did screw up. You're seeing some weirdness here. What are you actually seeing? There's one user registered, not intentional, but what does this syntax suggest we're looking at? This is a dictionary. Recall that the db.execute method that comes with CS50 SQL library gives you a list of dictionary objects. And so because there's only one registrant at the moment, you're seeing my dictionary for my registration, which is not what I want to show here, and I forgot. I need to also go back into the registrants template to tweak my syntax as follows. Let me go back into VS Code here. Let me go into registrants.html, and because I am passing in now not a dictionary, but a list of dictionaries, I just need to think about the problem a little bit differently. So my syntax here is going to be for each, let's do this as follows. For each registrant in that registrant's list of dictionaries, go ahead and display the current registrant's name and go ahead and display the current registrant's sport. In other words, I'm using Python syntax, which works as well in Jinja here. This iterates over the list of registrants, each of which is a dictionary. So I'm using dictionary syntax now to index into the name key of the registrant dict object and the sport key of the same. So now let me go back to my browser, and I'm just going to go ahead and reload the registrants page without resubmitting the form. Now there it is, David and basketball. And now let's go back to the form and register a couple more people. Kelly for soccer, register. Notice we're at the registrants link. Kelly is indeed still registered. Let me go back to this and let's register John. Ultimate Frisbee, register. Let's go ahead and kill the Flask server by going to my first terminal.
Oh, mine's all jacked up, bro. Man. That my shit all up. Register not found. that like destroy it so freaking bad? Delete this. See what that does. And let's delete this. Cause this stuff's just. I don't understand what the hell.
Oh my mind, baby, in time. Like the way you work it, yo diggity.
We're leaving.
I mean, if you don't want to, we could go get rings some other time. If that's just a lot, I still gotta stop by the tattoo shop.
No, but I mean, we're going to pick somebody up at a certain time, aren't we?
Sativa, I gotta go get her.
Right now?
Yep, she gets out early.
Okay.
Okay.
Alright, I guess I'll stop since everything's crashing out anyways.
Is it crashing out?
Yeah, I was following his instructions and then the website wasn't working. Now I have another error, so I'm kind of pissed off right now, but whatever.
Well, then let me, excuse me, steal you away. He rolled his eyes, just so y'all know. He's like, you always steal me away.
Alright, I guess I'm getting off mid-progress and everything started messing up. And so
I can just go and we'll just do it some other time, babe.
that's fine.